Hey there, welcome back. Pull the blanket up a little closer. It's a cold one tonight. Get comfortable, because where we're headed, comfort was never part of the deal. Picture this. It's well past dark and you have been on horseback since 3 in the afternoon. The road beneath you disappeared a while ago, swallowed whole by the night. Somewhere ahead there's a bed waiting for you. But it isn't your bed. It isn't even a private one. It's a shared bed in a room full of strangers behind a door that barely shuts, let alone locks. And the woman climbing into it tonight is only trying to survive until morning. Before we step inside, let's make a small deal, you and me. If a story like this one pulls you in even just a little, tap that like button for me. It costs you nothing, and it tells me these quiet old stories are worth telling. If this is your first night here, stay a while and subscribe. There is a whole world of nights like this one still waiting for you. No pressure, no rush. Just something nice to come back to whenever your own night gets a little too quiet. And I would love to know, where are you tonight and what time is it where you're listening from? Leave it in the comments below. I go through every single one and I always love finding you there. Alright, turn the lights down if you haven't already. Maybe let a fan hum somewhere nearby just for that soft, steady sound. Get warm, get still. Because tonight we're going back to the year 1704. Her name was Sarah Kemble Knight. And for the next few minutes you're not just going to hear her story. You're going to step right inside it. It's Monday, October the 2nd, 3 o'clock in the afternoon in the city of Boston. The harbour smells like salt and tar. Somewhere behind her, a church bell marks the hour. Sarah is 38 years old, a widow, a mother, a woman who has spent the past year running her own household alone ever since she lost her husband. Her daughter Elizabeth stands near the doorway of their home on Moon Street, watching her mother check the straps on her saddle one more time than necessary. Her aging mother sits inside saying nothing, because there is nothing left to say that hasn't already been said twice this morning. "Write to us when you can," Elizabeth says quietly, and Sarah nods, though both of them already know how unlikely that is once the road actually begins. Sarah is about to do something almost no woman of her time would dare to do. She is going to ride out of the city by herself toward a place 200 miles away. The reason isn't romantic, it's business. A cousin has passed and his widow needs help settling the estate. Sarah, sharp with numbers and familiar with legal papers, happens to be one of the few people fit for the job. Her own kinsman, a captain named Robert Lewis, walks beside her horse as far as the edge of town, talking the whole way, mostly to fill the silence. At the last house before the open road he stops. She doesn't. After that she's on her own. Well, almost. Along the road she hires a local man to guide her through a stretch of forest and swamp. He talks constantly, weaving tales so tall and so confident that Sarah will later describe him, half laughing, as a man who seemed to fancy himself a prince in disguise. At his house, where they stop to change horses, his daughter looks Sarah over from head to boot and asks, in that blunt way only a stranger can manage, why a woman would ever travel a road like this alone. Sarah doesn't flinch. She tells the girl plainly that the question itself is rude and swings back up onto her horse. So if you're wondering whether women in 1704 were expected to have sharp tongues and sharper spines, the answer, at least for Sarah, is yes. By evening she reaches the small town of Dedham. She'd hoped to meet a post rider here, an official courier who could guide her the rest of the way. He never shows. She visits the local Reverend, a Mr. Belcher, hoping to wait out the delay under his roof. The fire is warm there, the offer is sincere, any sensible traveller would stay. But Sarah cannot sit still. She wants to press on 12 miles further, to a house where the rider is known to stop for the night. It's the Reverend's wife, a woman known simply as Madam Belcher, who finally understands there is no talking this particular guest out of the road. So Madam Belcher does something quietly remarkable. She puts on her own coat and walks Sarah personally through the cooling evening to the local tavern to help her find a guide willing to go the rest of the way in the dark. Now picture that tavern for a moment. Low ceilings thick with wood smoke, a fire cracking in a wide stone hearth, A dog asleep near the ashes, one ear twitching at every footstep. The floor is packed dirt worn smooth by hundreds of boots before Sarah's. A handful of local men are gathered around a rough table, mugs in hand, in absolutely no hurry to go anywhere at all. Their laughter is loud. Their coats smell of horse and pipe smoke. Sarah asks the hostess, the woman running the house that night, to find her someone willing to guide a stranger through the dark for a fair price. The hostess is quick and no-nonsense, the kind of woman who's clearly run this room for years, moving between tables without ever quite stopping. She moves from man to man, asking, waiting, asking again. But most of the men in that room, Sarah later writes, are tied to their drink by the lips, and unwilling to let go of it for love or money. Finally, one man agrees more out of curiosity than kindness, it seems. And so with night fully fallen, Sarah rides on into roads she doesn't know, over bridges she doesn't trust, across streams swollen from the season's rain. An owl calls somewhere off to the side, and her horse's ears flick toward the sound. The air turns colder as the road climbs, and her breath shows in front of her pale and quick. She will later call these hidden dangers her bugbears, the small, nagging terrors that follow a fearful traveller through the dark. It isn't hard to understand why. There are no street lamps out here, no signs, no one to call if the guide turns out to be less than honest. Just her, a stranger on a horse, and whatever waits past the next bend. Somewhere in the dark, riding through a forest, she cannot see the edges of Sarah thinks of home, of her daughter asleep in Boston by now, of her mother, who she once described in her own words as aged and tender, a woman she worries over even now, even out here, hours from anywhere familiar. This is the part of the story we don't always picture, isn't it? Not just the danger, but the ache of missing the people you left behind, even while doing something brave enough to make them proud. At last, worn through and cold to the bone, she reaches an ordinary for the night. That's what taverns were often called back then, an ordinary house, offering an ordinary night's rest, to anyone able to pay for it. A little warmth reaches her before the door even fully opens. Wood smoke and something simmering in a pot, and for a moment that alone feels like enough. The room she's shown to is small, lit by one thin candle. The bed is not soft. The blanket is thin, and someone else's boots already sit by the door. And she is not offered a room of her own, because in 1704, that simply isn't how a tavern works. A traveller pays for a place in a bed. Not the whole bed, just a place in it. Tonight that place is shared with people she's never met and will likely never see again after sunrise. Her companion for the night turns out to be another traveller, a woman about her own age, already curled beneath the blanket when Sarah steps into the room. Neither one says very much. There isn't a need to. This is simply how a night on the road works, and both of them know the unspoken rules by heart. Sarah settles onto her half of the tick, feeling the straw shift and crackle underneath her, still fully in most of her clothes the way most travellers slept back then. The other woman's breathing slows into something steady. A stranger's warmth inches away in the dark. It is not what we picture, is it, when we imagine a quiet night's rest? She lies down, aching from the ride, hoping only for a few quiet hours of stillness before the next long day on the road. She does not get them. From nearby, maybe the very same room, maybe just past a thin wooden wall, a group of local men have started up an argument. Not about politics, not about money, about a name. They are arguing loudly and with total confidence over why the region nearby is called Narragansett, each man certain he alone holds the true answer, none of them willing to give an inch. One insists it comes from an old native word for a point of land. Another swears it was named for a person long forgotten. A third simply shouts louder as though volume alone might settle the matter. It goes on by her own account until nearly 2 a.m. Beside her the other woman doesn't stir. Somehow she has learned to shut it all out. Sarah, still new to this kind of night, has not. Now, if you've ever tried to sleep in a hotel with only a wall between you and a party next door, you already understand exactly how Sarah felt that night. Some things, it turns out, have not changed in 300 years. We just complain about it differently now. Sarah didn't have a front desk to call. She had a straw mattress a stranger beside her, and a very long list of opinions about the men next door. What Sarah could not have known lying there in the dark, listening to strangers argue over a word, was this: that small worn notebook she was keeping of her journey, filled in by candlelight, night after night, would outlast her by nearly a century. It would sit forgotten among a family's private papers long after her death, passed quietly from one relative to the next. And then in 1825 it would finally be printed and become one of the only first-hand windows historians have into what early New England actually looked, sounded and smelled like. She could not have known either that in just 2 years she would open her own school back in Boston, and that, according to more than one historian, a young boy named Benjamin Franklin may have sat among her students. The record isn't perfectly clear on that last part, but the fact that people are still asking the question more than 300 years later tells you something about the kind of woman Sarah Kemble Knight was. So there she is, 38 years old, alone in a shared bed inside a stranger's tavern, wide awake at 2 a.m, listening to grown men argue about a word. Back in Boston, her daughter and her mother are asleep in a house that suddenly feels very far away, and somehow this is only the first night of a 5-month journey that has barely begun. If you take one thing from tonight, let it be this: long before any of us had a name for it, there were women like Sarah quietly proving that courage doesn't always look like a battlefield. Sometimes it looks like a woman on a borrowed horse, wide awake in a stranger's bed, simply refusing to turn back. Which leaves us with a question worth sitting with for a moment. What exactly was this place she had just walked into? Why could any traveller, rich or poor man or woman, simply knock on a door in the middle of the night and expect a bed, a meal and a fire, no matter how small or strange the town? And why out of every single building in a small colonial town was this one, the tavern, so often the most important one of all? That answer might surprise you. And it starts right where we left off, on the other side of that tavern door. Here is the strange part. Remember that tavern Sarah finally stumbled into, worn out and half-frozen somewhere past midnight. As ordinary as that room looked from the outside, the building itself was doing far more work than it let on. If you had stopped anyone in New England that year and asked them what a tavern actually was, you would not have gotten a simple answer, because a tavern in 1704 was not really one single thing. It was closer to 5 or 6 different things, all wearing the same coat. To us sitting here, safely tucked into whatever year this happens to be for you, the word tavern sounds almost cozy. Wooden beams, candlelight, maybe a fiddle playing somewhere in the corner. Hollywood has sold us a version of this place built mostly out of brawling and cheap whiskey. The truth is far less dramatic and honestly far more interesting. A tavern in colonial America was not somewhere you went for fun the way we might picture a bar today. For most travellers, it was not optional at all. It was simply the only roof available between one town and the next, and the law treated it that way. There is a reason so many of these places were called an ordinary, the word we touched on a moment ago. It was not a nickname. It functioned closer to a legal category. An ordinary was a public house required by county law to serve a fixed meal at a fixed price to any traveller who walked through the door, no bargaining involved. The price wasn't set by the keeper. It was set months in advance by a court, sometimes down to the exact number of pence. Some counties even required a keeper to put in writing the difference between what they called a good meal and a common one, so no traveller could later complain they had paid fine dining prices for a thin, watery soup. Sit with that for a second. In an age with no restaurant reviews and no complaint hotline, the government itself was already doing the reviewing on paper before a single pot was ever set over the fire. Now the word tavern gets used loosely today, almost as a catch-all for anything old and wooden, so it's worth slowing down and sorting out the actual differences, because the people who dealt with them every day certainly knew them. An ordinary, as we just covered, put the emphasis on the meal and the fixed price attached to it. Plenty of ordinaries were small, plain and rural, sometimes barely bigger than the keeper's own farmhouse, and intended to sit a rung higher. The word carries an Old English root simply meaning a dwelling, but by this period it had come to describe a grander operation, usually built along a major coaching route, with real stable capacity for a dozen horses or more because stagecoaches and their teams needed somewhere proper to rest as much as the passengers did. Picture the difference for a moment. A rural ordinary might be a farmhouse with one extra room run by a family who also ploughed their own fields by day. A proper coaching inn, by contrast, could employ a whole staff hostlers to manage the horses, a cook, a house servant or two, and still turn away business on a busy night. Both were licensed. Both were legally bound to serve you. But walking into one after the other would have felt like stepping between two entirely different centuries. A tavern, the broadest term of the three, could mean almost any of the above, though it leaned toward describing the more social, more urban version, the kind of establishment where drink and conversation mattered just as much as the bed upstairs. Curiously enough, the word itself traces back to an old Latin term for a simple hut, or shop, a far cry from the grand pillared buildings some of these places would eventually become, and in Britain, a slightly different label was already creeping in by the middle of the century: public house, a term born from humbler alehouses gradually absorbing the word tavern into it as the decades passed until in England tavern started to sound almost old-fashioned. Interestingly, that split in vocabulary never fully caught on back in the colonies, and if you notice a small-town restaurant or historic building calling itself a tavern somewhere across the United States today, you're hearing the echo of that old word still stubbornly refusing to retire. Running any one of these houses was never something a person simply decided to do on a whim. You needed a license, an actual document granted by a county court or a colonial governor, giving you legal permission to sell drink and offer a bed under your own roof. In many counties, an applicant also had to bring neighbours forward to vouch for their character, and sometimes had to post a bond, a sum of money held as a guarantee of good behaviour, before the court would even consider the request. This was taken seriously enough that in a town like Williamsburg, officials kept roughly one licensed tavern for somewhere between every 100 and every 130 residents. Picture your own hometown for a second and imagine that same ratio applied today, a licensed public house on practically every other street corner. It sounds almost absurd until you remember why it existed in the first place. Travel demanded it. A growing colony full of merchants, farmers, sailors, and circuit-riding judges needed somewhere to stop every few miles, because the alternative, sleeping outdoors through a New England winter, barely counted as an alternative at all. Across the ocean, the word carried a slightly different weight from the start. In England, a tavern had first appeared centuries earlier as a place where wine specifically was sold to the public, a small step above the humbler alehouse down the street. By the middle of the 1700s, something interesting happened in Britain that never quite happened the same way in the colonies. Wealthier city dwellers began drifting toward a newer kind of establishment, the coffee house leaving the old taverns and alehouses to a more working-class crowd. In the American colonies, that particular split barely took root. A merchant, a farmer, a travelling preacher, and a stagecoach driver might all end up seated at the very same table, whether they liked it or not. If you enjoy imagining what a country might look like without the class-sorted coffee shop on every corner, colonial taverns are in a strange way a decent place to start looking. Here is a detail I happen to find quietly brilliant, and it rarely makes it into the history books. Most people in the 1700s could not make out written words at all. Formal schooling was far from universal, especially once you left the larger towns behind. So how did an exhausted traveller riding into an unfamiliar village at dusk know which building was the tavern? The answer swung gently above the door. A carved painted sign showing a picture instead of a word, a green dragon, a white stag, a golden horse, a bunch of grapes. These were never simple decorations. They were addresses long before addresses existed. And here is where it gets particularly interesting. A tavern actually carried two names at once. There was the name of whoever happened to be running the place that particular year, and then there was the name of the sign itself, which almost never changed at all. A keeper could sell the business, retire, or pass away, and the new owner would often keep the very same swinging sign outside, because regular customers, and more importantly travellers, who might only pass through once already knew that picture by heart. Changing it would have meant throwing away the address itself. One tavern in Boston, kept for years under the sign of a green dragon, would later become one of the most talked about meeting rooms in the entire story of the American Revolution. That particular thread belongs to a much later part of tonight, so I will leave it there for now like a pin stuck quietly into a map waiting for us to come back to it. Even the shape of these signs tells you something once you know how to look. The earliest ones, carved around the middle of the century, carried heavy crowned tops echoing the same fashionable furniture wealthier families were putting in their parlours at the time. A few decades later, sign makers had switched to lighter, curved tops matching the newer, more delicate furniture style becoming popular in those same towns. Interestingly, in Britain, some of these signs were carved as full, three-dimensional figures, a wooden bear or a painted lion standing out from the building itself. In the colonies, that kind of extravagance was rare. Most American taverns kept things flatter and plainer, a simple painted board swinging from a post, which tells you something quiet but real about how differently the two sides of the ocean chose to spend their money on show. In other words, a tavern sign hanging outdoors through rain and rough weather was without anyone necessarily meaning it to be a small and honest record of changing taste. If you wanted to guess which decade you had wandered into, you could sometimes simply look up. A license, though, was never a free pass to do whatever a keeper liked. That single piece of paper came with plenty of strings attached, and some of them tell us quite a bit about the values and the blind spots of the time. A licensed keeper was legally required to keep a spare bed, ready food available, and stable space for a traveller's horse at more or less any hour of the day or night. Turning away a paying guest with nowhere else to go was in many colonies flatly against the law, but the same rulebook could also be deeply unfair. In several colonies, laws specifically limited or restricted what a tavern could serve to enslaved people, and to free black colonists and sailors were often viewed with the same suspicion, treated as unreliable transient customers, unlikely to settle a bill. It is an uncomfortable detail, but an honest history of these rooms has to include who the law welcomed easily, and who it made harder to serve. On top of that, a keeper could lose the license entirely. Allow known troublemakers to gather under your roof, let drunkenness spiral out of hand, or pour drinks during Sunday church hours in a strict New England town, and a magistrate could shut the entire operation down sometimes within a single court session. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. This was never the modern idea of a private business free to run purely as its owner pleased. A tavern sat somewhere between a private home and a public utility bound by law to serve you, and just as bound by law to behave itself while doing so. Some historians actually point to these old fixed-price laws as one of the earliest working examples of consumer protection on this continent, centuries before anyone used that particular phrase. It's a strange thought that the humble roadside tavern might have quietly invented an idea we now take for granted every time we check a receipt, but taverns' role stretched even further than beds and meals, and this is the part that tends to surprise people the most. Need a small loan before continuing your journey. The keeper, often one of the wealthiest and best connected people in town, might arrange one on the spot sometimes against nothing more than a traveller's word and a good reputation. Want a ticket to next month's horse race or the latest news from London arriving weeks late by ship but still the freshest available in town? The tavern usually had it first chalked up on a board or passed along by whoever had just ridden in from the coast. Travelling performers, public auctions, even a hand of cards or a friendly wager, all of it tended to happen under this one roof, because there was quite simply nowhere else in town equipped to hold it. Try to name a single modern building that does all of that at once: a bank, a newsroom, a theatre, an auction house, and a bar all under one low ceiling. It's difficult, isn't it? And that difficulty says something about just how much weight one small wooden building was expected to carry night after night in a town that otherwise had almost nothing else. Because a tavern was so often the only large public room in an entire town. Aside from the meeting house or the church, it rarely stayed just a place to eat and drink for very long. County courts sometimes held their sessions in the tavern's largest room simply because there was nowhere bigger nearby. Militia companies mustered just outside its door. In more than a few colonial towns, elections were held quite literally on the tavern's front steps, with the keeper's own guest ledger doubling as the closest thing available to a voter record. Try picturing the modern version of that for a second. Your dentist's waiting room doubling as your town's only polling station, its only source of gossip, and its only place to grab dinner all at once. That is roughly the load a colonial tavern was carrying quietly every single day without anyone thinking to call it remarkable. So here's a question worth turning over in your mind for a moment. If I asked you to guess how many separate public buildings a small colonial town typically had besides its church, what number would you land on 3-5 for a great many towns? The honest answer was 1. And by now you already know exactly which building that was. It's worth remembering this the next time you picture Sarah or any traveller like her, ducking through a low tavern doorway on a cold night. She wasn't just looking for a bed. Whether she realised it or not, she was walking into the closest thing that town had to a courthouse, a newspaper, a bank and a town square all pressed into one smoky, crowded room. Which brings us to something worth sitting with for a moment. If the law truly required a tavern keeper to find room for every traveller who came knocking, no matter how late the hour, what actually happened on the nights when every single bed inside was already taken? What happened when 2, 3, sometimes 4 exhausted travellers arrived at the very same door all at once, all cold, all expecting the bed the law had in theory already promised each one of them? That particular kind of chaos turns out to be far stranger and honestly far funnier than you might expect. And it is exactly where we are headed next. So let's answer that properly. What actually happened when a tavern ran out of room was, in a word, nothing like what we would expect today. There was no telephone to call ahead. No list at a front desk with your name already on it. In fact, there was no concept of a reservation at all, not in the way we understand one now. A tavern keeper simply had no way of knowing on any given evening whether 3 travellers would arrive that night or 30. Weather changed without warning. Roads flooded. Guides got lost the way Sarah's nearly did. A stagecoach might break an axle 3 miles out and dump 6 extra passengers on a tavern's doorstep that was only ever built to sleep 4. Nobody could plan for any of it, least of all the person running the house. So the entire system ran on one blunt, almost brutally fair principle. Whoever walked through the door first got the better spot. Whoever walked through last got whatever remained, if anything remained at all. Now here's where it gets interesting, because you might assume that better spot cost more money. Strangely, it often didn't. At Gadsby's Tavern, a well-documented establishment in Alexandria, Virginia, historians have been able to piece together exactly how one of these shared sleeping rooms worked, right down to the pricing. Guests paid the very same rate whether they ended up on an actual bedstead or on a simple pallet laid flat across the floor. The room filled on a strict first-come, first-served basis, and once every real bed was claimed, the next traveller through the door paid full price for nothing more than a blanket and a patch of floorboards. Sit with that for a moment, because it tells you something the price lists from fancier establishments never do. In that room, a well-dressed merchant and a saddle-sore farmhand were financially speaking treated as equals. The only thing separating a real mattress from bare wood that night was who happened to arrive 20 minutes earlier. It's a strange kind of fairness, isn't it? Not designed with any noble intention behind it. Just a plain practical rule that almost by accident refused to care who you were. If you had told the average tavern keeper he was running one of the more egalitarian rooms in the entire colony, he probably would have laughed and asked you to settle your bill. Before any of that sorting even began, though, there was a small ritual most of us never think to picture. Your horse went first always. A stable hand, sometimes a servant, sometimes the keeper's own son, would guide it away to be fed and watered, before you had even finished stepping down from the saddle. Many English-style inns kept a servant whose entire job and eventually entire nickname revolved around a single task: scraping the mud and grime off a traveller's boots after a long day on the road. People simply called him the Boots. It's a small detail, but I like it because it tells you that even the humblest job in that building carried a name of its own worn almost like a badge. Imagine spending your whole working life known to hundreds of strangers only by the object you cleaned for them. Only after the horse and the boots were seen to did a traveller actually step into the main room, damp, tired, and completely unsure whether there would be anywhere left to sit, let alone sleep. Once inside, the historian Alice Morse Earle, who spent years piecing together accounts like these, described a fairly typical scene. A bare, sanded floor. Rows of plain seats and chairs pulled near a roaring fire, especially once the colder months set in. Nothing fancy, nothing soft, but warm, loud, and absolutely packed. And once inside, the class lines, faint as they usually were in a tavern, became a little more visible. The better appointed houses kept a separate parlour, a smaller, quieter room sometimes rented out entirely to a wealthy family, or offered as a rare sitting room for women travelling without a husband or father nearby. It came at a price when it was available at all, and it was never guaranteed. Plenty of nights even a paying guest with money in hand found the parlour already taken, and had no choice but to join everyone else, because everyone else meant exactly that. The common room sometimes stretched upstairs into a long low dormer under the roof, holding whatever mismatched beds the house could fit. Small windows, if there were windows at all. No fireplace up there most nights, which meant the space ran stifling in summer and bitterly cold come winter. And on the very worst nights, when even the floor of that dormer had run out of open space, latecomers were sent somewhere you might not expect. Out to the stable to bed down near the horses, which, uncomfortable as it sounds, at least came with the advantage of body heat and a roof that didn't leak. Picture that for a second. A merchant in his good travelling coat resigned to spending the night in the straw, listening to a horse shifting its weight a few feet away, probably telling himself this was at the very least a story worth telling once he made it home. This was where a farmer, a preacher, a travelling merchant, and a stranger nobody could quite place might all end up shoulder to shoulder by midnight, each one having paid more or less the very same coin for the privilege. So here's something worth asking yourself honestly. If you had been the one paying full price only to find the parlour already taken by someone else's family, would you have swallowed your pride and joined that packed snoring dormer anyway? Or would you have climbed back onto a tired horse in the dark, hoping the next tavern down the road had better luck waiting for you? Most travellers understandably chose the dormer. Here's a detail worth pausing on because it corrects an assumption most of us carry into this story without realising it. We tend to picture bed sharing among strangers as purely a last resort, a symptom of scarcity and nothing more. But colder months tell a different story. Without central heating of any kind, the only reliably warm patch in the whole building sat near the fire, and once you were away from it, a shared bed truly kept you warmer than an empty one ever could. 2 or 3 bodies under one blanket held on to heat an empty mattress simply could not hold on to alone. People weren't only doubling up because there was no other option. Plenty of nights they were doing it on purpose, the same instinctive way a family of raccoons might curl into one den, rather than 3 separate ones. Warmth, it turns out, made strangers out of necessity feel a little less strange. But here is the part that tends to catch modern viewers completely off guard, and honestly it caught me off guard the first time I came across it too. Even after you had claimed your spot, even after you had finally drifted off, your night was not necessarily finished. Later arrivals still needed somewhere to sleep, and if every other space in the house was gone, the keeper had one option left: your bed. Travellers of the era wrote about this almost matter-of-factly the way we might complain today about a delayed flight. A keeper would walk into the room, candle in hand, wake the newcomer just enough to guide him across the dark floor, and settle him quietly into the same bed you were already sleeping in. By morning you might not even learn his name, his trade, or where he had ridden in from. Think about the sheer trust that required on every side of that exchange. The keeper trusted the stranger not to cause trouble. You, asleep and unaware, were simply trusted along with everyone else in the room, and the newcomer, half awake himself, had to trust that the 2 people he'd never met now inches away in the dark meant him no harm either. And if you objected, if you sat up and protested at finding a total stranger tucked in beside you at 2 a.m, you, not the tavern, were the one considered difficult, fussy, not suited for the road. That was simply how the system worked, and pushing back against it marked you as someone who didn't understand the rules everyone else had already accepted. A travelling doctor named Alexander Hamilton, no relation to the far more famous statesman who would share his name decades later, kept one of the more entertaining travel journals of the whole century. In 1744, riding through the northern colonies for his health, he found himself assigned to a room in a New York country inn with 3 men he had never met in his life. He described them afterward with a kind of weary, dry humour, the tone of a man who had clearly given up expecting anything else by that point in his trip. 2 great hulking fellows with long black beards and a third younger man he called simply raw-boned. All 4 of them strangers an hour earlier spent the night sharing that single room, as though it were the most unremarkable thing in the world, because to everyone else in the building it absolutely was. Elsewhere on that same journey he complained good-naturedly of a different inn where the chatter and noise of other guests kept him tossing for hours, after he had already turned in for the night, his patience by his own account wearing thinner with every passing mile of the trip. If you're picturing yourself in that exact scenario right now, be honest with me for a second. Would you have slept a single wink? Or would you have spent the whole night wide awake listening to every creak, wondering which one of the great hulking fellows snored the loudest? And yet, for all the discomfort, something else was quietly happening in those crowded rooms too, something worth naming before we move on. Strangers forced shoulder to shoulder for one night only did not always stay strangers until morning. A merchant heading south might trade news with a farmer heading north, each one arriving somewhere the next day carrying a little more of the world than they had the evening before. Travel companions were made this way sometimes for the next 50 miles, sometimes for the rest of a life. There is a certain kind of honesty that comes from knowing you will likely never see the person beside you again. People spoke more freely in tavern beds than they might have anywhere else, precisely because the stakes felt so low. Whatever else the system lacked in comfort, it rarely lacked in conversation. Not every visitor found this arrangement charming, by the way, and their complaints are almost as revealing as the custom itself. One English officer touring the colonies wrote home with open irritation about it, calling the whole practice in his own words very disagreeable, and blaming it on the sheer number of people suddenly travelling through a countryside whose small houses were never built to entertain quite so many guests at once. There's something almost funny about that complaint today, coming from a visitor whose own country would go on to popularise the phrase an Englishman's home is his castle. Apparently that castle simply hadn't reached the colonial frontier yet. Out here, everyone's home was on any given night potentially yours too. It raises an interesting question about culture rather than simple comfort. The officer wasn't wrong that colonial houses were smaller and more crowded than what he was used to back home. But his real discomfort seems to have come from something deeper, an expectation of personal space that the colonies still young, still scrambling to build enough roofs for everyone travelling under them, simply hadn't had the luxury of developing yet. Comfort, it turns out, is often just custom wearing a fancier name. If any of this sounds oddly familiar, by the way, you're not imagining things. Book a hostel bunk today, or end up on the receiving end of an overbooked hotel during a busy holiday weekend, and you will find echoes of exactly this same chaos, just with better lighting and considerably fewer strangers described as great and hulking. We like to imagine progress as a straight line always moving away from discomfort. But travel, it turns out, has been quietly recycling the same handful of headaches for centuries. We've simply gotten better at hiding them behind a check-in app and a 5-star rating system. At least tonight, whoever you end up sharing a wall with, chances are nobody is going to walk into your room at 2 a.m. and introduce you to them personally. And once you are finally settled, no matter how that settling happened, the peace rarely lasted long anyway. One traveller of the period, a young lawyer named Josiah Quincy, remembered mornings that began with nothing more than a thin line of candlelight sliding beneath his door at 3 a.m, the household's quiet signal that it was already time to rise, dress in the dark and be back on the road before the sun had any real say in the matter. There was no snoozing an alarm, no lingering over a second cup of anything. The road simply did not care how well or how poorly you had slept the night before, tucked between a merchant, a farmhand, and whoever the keeper had quietly added to the room, somewhere around midnight. So by now a fair question starts to form in your mind, and it's one worth sitting with. If beds were shared this freely, this casually among total strangers, night after night across an entire century, what did that actually do to people's sense of privacy itself as an idea? Did it even exist yet in the way we understand it now? Or was it something people were only just beginning to invent? Because somewhere out there in a small English town, an entire piece of furniture became famous for pushing that idea to an almost unbelievable extreme drawing. Curious visitors from miles around just to lie down in it. And 2 men who would go on to help found an entire country once spent a night arguing in bed together about something as small as an open window. That story comes next. Let's start with the bed itself because it earns an introduction. In a small English town called Ware, north of London, an inn once commissioned a local carpenter named Jonas Fosbrook to build a bed. Not a bed for one family or even one couple. A bed roughly 11 feet across in every direction, carved from solid oak, decorated with painted figures and detailed woodwork that would have taken a skilled craftsman months to finish. Picture the scale of it for a second. Most beds of this period barely stretched wide enough for 2 grown adults to lie comfortably side by side. This one could have swallowed 3 or 4 ordinary beds whole, and still had room left over along the edges. If you own a modern king-sized mattress picture, pushing 2 more of them up against it, and you are still not quite at the size of this thing. Word puts its construction somewhere around 1590, which means that by the time our story reaches the 1700s, this bed was already old news, a fixture people had been talking about for well over a century. And people never really stopped talking about it because the inn that owned it had, whether by accident or by genius, invented one of the earliest tourist attractions in English history. The pitch was simple. Come stay the night and sleep in the biggest bed you will ever see in your life. How many people could it actually hold? That depends entirely on who you ask, and honestly that's part of the charm. The most commonly repeated figure puts it at 4 couples, comfortably lying side by side without so much as touching. A German prince who visited in the 1590s was so struck by it that he wrote the whole encounter into his own travel diary, describing half in wonder a bed wide enough that 4 couples could lie down together and never once brush against one another through the night. When visiting royalty takes the time to write home about your furniture, you know you've built something memorable. Less reliable, more legendary tellings claim the record stood at over 24 people, crammed in at once, supposedly set during a wager in the late 1600s, involving a group of butchers and their wives all packed in together purely to settle a bet. I would take that particular number with a healthy pinch of salt. But even the more modest, better documented claim 4 full couples in one bed is more than enough to make the point. This was not furniture. This was a spectacle you could climb inside of, and travellers treated it exactly that way. Guests took to carving their initials directly into the wood, or pressing a wax seal into the bedpost, leaving proof they had actually been there and slept in it themselves. Look closely at the surviving bed today, and you can still see decades upon decades of these little signatures layered over one another. A carpenter's careful artwork slowly turned into something closer to a guest book. Think about what that actually is for a second. Centuries before anyone ever checked in somewhere online or tagged a location in a photograph, people were leaving a physical permanent signature on a piece of furniture, purely to say I was here, I saw this, I slept in this absurd and wonderful thing. Some habits, it turns out, are simply older than the technology we now use to satisfy them. Swap the pocket knife for a smartphone, and you are looking at the exact same impulse 4 centuries apart. The bed became so well known that it slipped straight into popular culture the way a viral moment might land in a comedian's set today. William Shakespeare himself referenced it in Twelfth Night, having one of his characters joke about a sheet of paper so enormous it could practically cover the bed of Ware in England. Ben Jonson mentioned it in one of his own plays not long after. By the early 1600s, you didn't even need to have seen the thing yourself to get the joke. Everyone already knew exactly what you meant, the same way a comedian today can reference an oversized celebrity mansion and expect the whole room to laugh without further explanation. That kind of fame rarely fades quickly, and this bed's didn't. Writers kept reaching for it as their go-to comparison for anything absurdly impossibly large for well over 2 centuries after it was first built. A joke that keeps working for 200 years is not a small achievement for a piece of bedroom furniture. There was even a ghost story attached to it, one claiming the carpenter's own spirit returned to pinch or scratch anyone who dared sleep there, unless they were a true and faithful lover. It's a fantastic piece of folklore, and more than a few 19th century writers repeated it as though it were solid fact, passing it along in guidebooks and letters as a genuine local legend. Some accounts even suggested the pinching grew worse for anyone unfaithful in love, turning a simple mattress into something like a moral test. My honest guess, and I suspect quite a few historians would agree with me here, is that this ghost story was a wonderfully convenient way for an innkeeper to explain away something far less romantic. A traveller waking up covered in unexplained bites has a much better night's story to tell if a heartbroken carpenter's ghost did it, rather than the actual much itchier culprit, likely hiding somewhere in that very old, very well-used mattress. We will get to exactly what that culprit was later tonight, so file this one away for now. By the time we reach the 1700s, the bed had simply become part of the furniture of English cultural life, if you'll forgive the phrase. It moved at least once from its original home at the White Hart Inn to another nearby establishment called the Saracen's Head, continuing to draw curious sleepers well into the following century. It survives today at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where in 1931 curators paid £4,000 To acquire it a sum 4 times larger than the museum's entire annual furniture budget at the time. Apparently even 400 years later, this particular bed still knew how to make an entrance. Here's the thing worth sitting with, though. The Great Bed of Ware wasn't strange because it broke the rules of its era. It was famous precisely because it followed them, just at an exaggerated, almost theatrical scale. Because outside of that one spectacular room in Hertfordshire, ordinary households across England and its colonies were already treating shared beds as simply how life worked without any of the fanfare. A bed in this period was often the single most expensive object a family owned, worth more than most of the furniture in the rest of the house combined, sometimes even worth more than the family's livestock. Naturally, that meant most families could only ever afford one. Parents took the best of it. Children were tucked in nearby, sometimes on a smaller trundle bed that slid out from underneath, and disappeared beneath the main bed again by daylight, saving what little floor space the room had to spare. And in wealthier homes the arrangement grew even more layered. A lady's own maidservant frequently slept curled at the foot of her mistress's bed, not out of simple habit, but quite often for the woman's own protection, a built-in safeguard against any unwanted attention from other men under that same roof. Even at the very top of society, kings and queens rarely slept in true solitude, either surrounded instead by attendants whose entire job description involves staying within arm's reach through the night. Privacy, as we understand the word today, a room of one's own, a door that locks a bed nobody else has any claim to, simply was not yet part of how most people, rich or poor, imagined a normal life. So here's a genuine question worth turning over for a moment. If you had grown up your entire life sharing a bed with parents, siblings, and eventually a spouse would, climbing into bed beside a total stranger at a tavern, really have felt like such an enormous leap? Or would it have simply felt like Tuesday? Which brings us at last to 2 men most of us picture as marble statues rather than actual human beings, who once complained about each other's sleeping habits. September of 1776. The war for independence has only just begun, and the situation on the ground is deeply grim. American forces have just been badly beaten on Long Island, pushed back with heavy losses, and morale is fragile. Into that moment the British offer something rare, a chance to talk. General Howe, commanding the Royal Navy off the coast, invites a small delegation to meet him on Staten Island, hoping to negotiate an end to the fighting before it spreads any further. Congress sends 3 men for the job. Benjamin Franklin, already in his 70s and easily the most famous person in America, celebrated as much for his science as his politics. John Adams, 41 years old, sharp-tongued, proud, and by his own frequent admission, permanently a little cold. And Edward Rutledge from South Carolina rounding out the party. The stakes riding on this meeting were enormous. If the talk somehow worked, an entire war might end before it truly began. If they failed, and most of the men involved suspected the fighting was only going to grow worse from there. That is the weight these 3 men were quietly carrying with them down a muddy New Jersey road, long before anyone knew how the evening's sleeping arrangements would turn out to be the part remembered centuries later. On the way there, the 3 men stopped for the night in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and the town, packed with travellers and soldiers moving through amid the chaos of a war just getting started, has almost nothing left to offer them. Only 2 rooms remain at the local inn. Rutledge takes one. Franklin and Adams, the 2 most important minds in the entire delegation, are left to share the other, a room in Adams' own words, barely larger than the bed itself, with no chimney and only a single small window. Now, if 2 of the men who would go on to help shape an entire nation had simply gone to sleep that night, this would be a forgettable footnote. They did not go to sleep. Adams, worried about catching a chill from the night air, gets up and shuts the window tight. Franklin, already lying down, immediately protests. Don't shut the window, he says, or the two of them will be suffocated before morning. Adams pushes back, explaining he is afraid of the evening air settling on him while he sleeps. Franklin characteristically refuses to let the point go. The air already trapped inside this small chamber, he argues, is worse for them than anything drifting in from outside. Open it, he insists, come to bed and let me explain why. Adams, by his own later account, was curious enough despite himself to hear the reasoning out. He climbed in window open, bracing for whatever came next. What came next was a full lecture. Franklin had his own theory about colds, one he had apparently written about before arguing that people don't catch a chill from cold air at all, but from being cooped up in stale, unmoving air indoors, breathing the same recycled atmosphere over and over until it turns against them. So Franklin does what Franklin does best. He starts explaining, at length, air and cold and breathing and how the body loses heat on and on deep into the night. Adams, drifting towards sleep despite his best efforts, later admitted in his own diary that he simply could not keep his eyes open through the entire lecture on ventilation and respiration. Somewhere in the middle of Franklin's argument sentence still unfinished, Adams drifted off, entirely leaving the most brilliant scientific mind in America still quietly making his case to an audience that had already stopped listening. Here's my honest take on that whole evening for what it's worth. History tends to remember Franklin as the clever one and Adams as the stiff one, and this story usually gets told as a punchline built entirely around that contrast. But look a little closer at what Franklin was actually arguing that night. Stale, unmoving indoor air spreading illness between people, crowded into a small space, is not far at all from how we now understand certain diseases actually travel. Franklin wasn't simply being stubborn for its own sake. He was in his own clumsy, self-assured way, edging toward an idea that wouldn't be fully proven correct for another century. Adams, meanwhile, wasn't wrong to be cautious either. He was simply working from the best information his era had handed him, which happened to be incomplete. Neither man had access to what we now know. They were just two exhausted travellers doing their best with the science available to them at the time in the middle of the night, in a room too small for the argument they were having. Two brilliant, occasionally infuriating men stuck sharing one bed on a cold night, each one certain he had science on his side. If that doesn't sound at least a little familiar to anyone who's ever argued with a partner over a thermostat, I'm not sure what would. And notice where all of this actually happened. Not in some grand hall in Philadelphia, not in a drawing room built for important conversations, in a cramped-in bedroom, the exact kind of building we've been walking through together tonight, with two of history's most consequential men doing exactly what Sarah and the Reverend's wife and a doctor named Hamilton and a nameless English officer had all already discovered for themselves. When the road runs out of daylight, everyone, regardless of how their name eventually ends up printed in a history book, ends up needing the very same thing. A bed shared or otherwise, and whoever happens to be lying beside them that night. So here's a question worth carrying with you for a moment. If privacy as a real expectation barely even existed yet, not for ordinary travellers, not even for the men busy inventing a brand new country, what did people actually do about it, once they finally climbed under those shared blankets? What exactly were they lying on night after night in rooms with no bed of their own to speak of, and just how much a say did they even have in the matter? Because it turns out the mattress underneath all of this drama has a strange story of its own, involving straw rope and a small metal tool most of us have never heard of, but that every single tavern in this story absolutely depended on. That's exactly where we're headed next. Let's take that mattress apart piece by piece, because almost nothing about it works the way you'd expect. First, the sack itself. In this period, nobody called it a mattress. They called it a tick, a simple fabric bag usually made from a tough, tightly woven material called ticking. sturdy enough that whatever got stuffed inside it couldn't work its way back out through the seams. The cloth itself often came from hemp woven into a coarse fabric, sometimes called tow cloth, the very same rough material that shirts and work frocks were cut from during this period. In other words, the bag you slept inside every night and the shirt on your back might well have started life as the exact same bolt of cloth. And here's a detail that truly surprised me the first time I came across it. Many travellers actually carried their own tick with them rolled up and empty tucked into their luggage. Not the stuffing itself, just the bag. When they reached wherever they were staying, they would simply have it filled with whatever material was cheap and available locally, then empty it out again before moving on to the next stop. Think about that for a second. People weren't just packing clothes and papers for a journey. They were packing the outer shell of their own bed because they could learn the hard way that they couldn't count on finding one waiting for them. So what actually went inside that shell? That depended almost entirely on how much money you had and the season you happened to be travelling in. Straw was the cheapest, most common option, by far plentiful right after a harvest and easy enough to replace. It also had one significant downside nobody warns you about in the history books. It's loud. Every single time you shifted your weight in the night, the whole mattress would crunch and rustle beneath you, an endless crackling percussion section you had absolutely no control over. Corn husks did something similar, only louder, and with the added charm of occasionally attracting mice looking for an easy meal. If you've ever tried to sleep next to someone eating chips in bed, you already have a fairly accurate sense of what an entire night on a fresh straw or corn husk tick sounded like. In some parts of Europe, households experimented with other fillings, entirely dried beech leaves, in particular said to smell faintly of green tea and hold their softness for years longer than straw ever could. Wealthier households in 17th century France even had a name for beds stuffed with chestnut leaves, though those by most accounts rustled even worse than straw, and were eventually abandoned for exactly that reason. Every option, it turns out, involved some kind of trade. Comfort against cost, softness against sound, warmth against smell. At the very top of the ladder sat the feather bed, soft, warm, and unmistakably a symbol of money. A proper feather mattress could actually outlast several generations of ticking around it. When the fabric finally wore thin, families would simply empty the feathers out and stuff them into a brand new sack, meaning the actual filling. You slept on some nights might have already comforted your grandparents decades earlier in a completely different bed. It's a strange kind of inheritance, isn't it, passed down not through a will but through goose down. And at the very bottom of that same ladder, servants and enslaved people in many wealthier households were given none of this comfort at all. They were left with a bare straw or hay pallet on the floor, no feather bed, no bolster, sometimes not even a proper tick, while the family they served slept quite literally on a softer version of the exact same century. None of this stayed neatly in place on its own either. A straw or chaff tick needed daily attention just to stay usable. Every morning, someone, usually a wife, a daughter, or a household servant, would have to reach a bare hand deep into the fabric and physically fluff the contents back into an even layer, breaking up the clumps that had settled overnight wherever the sleeper's weight had pressed hardest. Skip that small daily ritual for even a few days, and you would wake up sleeping on a lumpy, uneven surface with hollow spots in all the wrong places. It's the kind of unglamorous, repetitive labour that keeps an entire household comfortable, while almost never earning a single mention in the history books, which is exactly why I wanted to mention it here. A traveller could often judge the quality of an inn before ever seeing the actual room purely by its reputation for how well it kept its beds. Word travelled fast along coaching routes about which houses kept fresh, well-maintained ticks, and which ones let their straw go flat and sour for weeks at a time. In a world with no formal reviews, no printed ratings, this kind of word of mouth was the only guide a traveller really had, and it's worth remembering just how fragile that whole system of comfort actually was. A good night's sleep in this period depended on dozens of small, unglamorous decisions made by someone else entirely out of your control. Whether the straw had been changed recently, whether the ropes had been tightened that season, whether the keeper bothered fluffing the tick that morning or simply made the bed up quickly and moved on to the next chore. You could pay full price and still end up on a lumpy, sagging, weeks-old mattress with absolutely no way of knowing that in advance. Comfort back then was less something you purchased outright, and more something you gambled on every single time you walked through an unfamiliar door. Wealthier households in this period actually layered their beds, and the logic behind it is more clever than you might expect. A firm, sturdy mattress, usually stuffed with corn husks or horsehair, went on the bottom to hold everything's shape and keep the sleeper from sinking straight through to the ropes below. Then on top of that came the soft feather bed itself, followed by bolsters and pillows stacked up high, sometimes 2 or 3 deep. Here's the part that tends to surprise people. Featherbeds sagged. A lot. Lie flat on one and you would slowly sink into a soft, shapeless hollow that did your back absolutely no favours, the feathers shifting and pooling wherever your weight pressed hardest. So the wealthy solution wasn't a firmer featherbed. It was propping yourself up on pillows instead, sleeping at something closer to an incline than lying fully flat. If you have ever wondered why so many old portraits and paintings show people resting in bed at an odd half-sitting angle, propped against a small mountain of pillows, now you know. It likely wasn't fashion, or at least not fashion alone. It was the mattress fighting back, and pillows were simply how everyone learned to negotiate a truce with it. Now underneath all of that soft material sat the part of the bed doing the real structural work, and it had nothing to do with straw or feathers at all. Picture the wooden frame of a bedstead with no solid base, the way most beds in this period were actually built. Instead of slats, or a metal frame rope was threaded back and forth across the frame, in a tight crisscross pattern, over and under, sometimes dozens of individual passes creating a woven lattice that the tick simply rested on top of. This rope lattice was quite literally the spring system of its day, centuries before anyone had thought to coil metal for the same purpose. Run your hand across one today in a museum, and you can still feel exactly how much give. It had a kind of springiness that would have felt almost futuristic compared to sleeping directly on bare wooden boards. And like any rope under constant weight night after night, it stretched. Slowly the tight crisscross pattern would loosen, and the whole bed would begin to sag toward the middle, a shallow dip forming right where your body pressed down hardest, deepening a little more with every week that passed without attention. Which is where a small, oddly specific tool comes in, one most of us have honestly never heard of. The bed key, sometimes called a bed wrench, a simple forked piece of wood or iron designed to grip a section of rope, twist it and pull the slack through until the whole lattice tightened back up again. It wasn't a quick job either. Someone had to work their way around the entire frame rope by rope, twisting and gathering the give until a fresh knot could be tied to hold the new tension in place. Miss a section, or tie the knot poorly, and that particular corner of the bed would simply sag again within days, undoing the whole afternoon's work. In many wealthier households and guest houses, this particular chore fell to enslaved workers. One more small, largely invisible task folded into the daily running of a home that history rarely bothers to mention, alongside cooking, cleaning, and the dozen other quiet labours that kept a household functioning. So here's a genuine question worth asking yourself. How many objects in your own bedroom right now would you have absolutely no idea how to repair with your own 2 hands? For most of us, I'm guessing that list is fairly long. For a household in 1776, a sagging bed wasn't a call to a delivery service or a same-day replacement ordered from a screen. It was an afternoon with a wooden key and some patience, and the knowledge passed down the same way most household skills were simply by watching someone else do it first. And this brings us to a phrase you have almost certainly said yourself, probably to a child, without ever questioning where it came from. Sleep tight. The popular story, repeated in more historic house tours than I can count, connects it directly to this very same rope bed. Tighten the ropes before bed, the story goes, and you'll sleep tight. It's a wonderful, tidy explanation, the kind that sounds so obviously correct that almost nobody thinks to question it. It also happens to be almost certainly false. Language historians have gone digging for the earliest recorded use of the phrase sleep tight, and the trail runs out remarkably late, not in some dusty 17th century diary, but in 1866 in the personal journal of a woman named Susan Bradford Epps. By then, rope beds had already been fading out of common use for decades, replaced by metal coil springs. The timing simply doesn't line up. As it turns out, the word tight had already meant soundly or well-going, all the way back to the 1500s, completely independent of any bed frame whatsoever, showing up in other old phrases about holding on firmly or sitting tight through hardship. Sleep tight, in other words, most likely just meant sleep well, the same plain wish it still carries today, borrowed from an older sense of the word rather than invented from a piece of furniture. I'll admit there's something a little bittersweet about debunking a story this charming, especially one so many of us grew up repeating without a second thought. But I'd argue the real history is more interesting anyway. An entire household working together with a wooden key to keep a rope frame from swallowing someone whole in their sleep doesn't need a clever turn of phrase attached to it to earn its place in this story. It was already remarkable enough on its own myth or no myth. Here's something worth connecting back to everything we've already talked about tonight, though, because it adds a piece we hadn't considered yet. Remember all that talk of strangers ending up pressed together in a single tavern bed? We've discussed the scarcity of space. We've discussed the practical warmth of sharing a blanket on a cold night. But there was a third force at work too, one built directly into the furniture itself. Once those ropes began to sag, gravity did the rest of the work entirely on its own. 2 or 3 or 4 people sharing a rope bed weren't simply choosing to end up shoulder to shoulder out of necessity or comfort. The dip in the middle of a well-used mattress would quietly, physically roll every single one of them toward the center of the bed, whether they wanted to end up there or not. So try picturing it for yourself. You've just met your bedfellow for the night, some stranger the keeper walked in by candlelight, and you both agree politely to keep to your own sides. Within the hour, the mattress itself has quietly overruled that agreement, and there you both are tangled together in the middle, blaming the rope instead of each other. It's a small, almost comic little detail, and yet it says something honest about how much of daily life in this era simply wasn't within anyone's control, no matter how carefully they tried to plan around it. It's worth pausing here for a moment to appreciate just how far we've come, and honestly how strange that distance really is. Somewhere out there tonight, a company is almost certainly advertising a mattress shipped to your front door in a compressed cardboard box engineered with cooling gel and individually wrapped coils, backed by a 100-night trial period and a lifetime warranty against exactly the kind of sagging our 1776 traveller simply accepted as a fact of life. Compare that for a moment to a traveller in 1776 carrying an empty fabric sack across state lines, hoping the local straw supply hadn't already gone damp in the rain, with no warranty, no trial period, and no one to call if the whole thing sagged flat within the month. Progress, it turns out, is real. It's just taken a few centuries longer than any of us probably assume, and it arrived one stubborn sagging rope bed at a time. But all that straw and chaff and corn husk sitting inside a warm fabric sack night after night rarely stayed as clean or as empty as anyone travelling through would have liked. Something else tended to move in alongside it, uninvited, largely unnoticed, until it was already far too late and utterly indifferent to how much money you had spent on your room. That's exactly what we need to talk about next. Remember that ghost story we talked about earlier tonight, the one about a heartbroken carpenter supposedly pinching sleepers in the middle of the night? I promised we would come back to the real explanation eventually, and a promise like that deserves keeping. Well, here it is, and I'll warn you now, it involves a fair amount of scratching. Bedbugs are not new to this story. They are not even new to human beds in general. People had been sharing their sleeping quarters with these small, flat, blood-hungry insects for centuries, before our era even begins, tucked into the seams of mattresses, the joints of wooden bed frames, and the folds of hanging curtains. For most of that long history, though, people mostly just shrugged and got on with things the same way we might shrug off a mosquito bite on a summer evening today. Take the English diarist Samuel Pepys writing all the way back in 1668. Travelling with a companion, he woke one morning to find their shared bed thoroughly infested. His own word for it was lousy, and his reaction, not disgust, not despair, but genuine amusement. He wrote that the discovery made the two of them merry, joking back and forth about which one of them had taken the worst bites overnight, comparing marks the way children might compare scraped knees after a rough afternoon of play. People at the time didn't even bother separating the culprits into tidy categories the way we do now. Lice, fleas, bedbugs, and other small biting things all got lumped together under the same handful of words, treated as one shared, mildly irritating fact of life, rather than a crisis worth losing sleep over in either sense of the phrase. A tired traveller waking up covered in bites had no real way of knowing or particularly caring which specific creature was responsible. The itch was the only fact that mattered. So here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If bedbugs had already been crawling through English and colonial beds for generations quietly, why does the 18th century in particular seem to be the moment everyone suddenly starts writing about them with real, genuine horror? Historians who study this shift, Lisa Saracen among them, point to something interesting happening in this exact period. It wasn't that the bugs themselves changed. It's that people's relationship to their own bodies, their own homes, and their own sense of what counted as clean began changing instead. Ideas about privacy, about the boundary between one's own body and the outside world, were shifting right alongside everything else we've already discussed tonight. The itch stayed exactly the same bite for bite, decade after decade. The meaning attached to that itch did not. It's a small reminder that disgust itself has a history. What repulses one century can barely register as an inconvenience to another, and vice versa. We tend to assume our own reactions are simply natural, obvious, permanent. They rarely are. We actually have a wonderful specific example of this fear playing out in real time from a Quaker missionary named Anne Warder, who travelled from England to Philadelphia in the 1700s. Writing in her diary about her very first night in New York, she recorded with obvious relief that she and her party had rested well in a clean white bed, one stripped entirely of its usual fabric hangings. Everyone in the city, she explained, was taking those hangings down on purpose, specifically to keep the bugs away, since the warm summer months made an infestation practically guaranteed otherwise. Picture that for a second. An entire city quietly agreeing to strip the decoration off their own beds purely out of a shared unspoken dread of what might be hiding inside the fabric folds. That's not a mild annoyance anymore. That's a genuine city-wide anxiety organised enough to change how people furnish their bedrooms season after season without anyone needing to issue an official proclamation about it. Word simply travelled neighbour to neighbour, the way practical fear tends to. And notice what Anne Warder found worth writing down at all. Not the food, not the scenery. A bed without hangings and the fact that she'd slept well because of it. When something as small as bedding earns its own line in a traveller's diary, you know exactly how much weight it was actually carrying in daily life. Now, where did all these bugs actually come from in such overwhelming numbers right around this period? The honest answer involves trade and ships and an uncomfortable irony worth sitting with. Colonial writings from the early 1700s document serious bedbug outbreaks across the English colonies and up into Canada. But here's the detail that tends to stop people in their tracks. Those same colonial records note that indigenous villages situated apart from the newly built European-style structures largely escaped the problem entirely. The bugs, it turns out, had crossed the ocean right alongside the colonists themselves, tucked into ships' timbers, bedding and cargo and unwelcome passenger riding along with everything else Europe brought to this continent. Some ships got wise to it, eventually going so far as to forbid passengers from bringing their own bedding on board at all, in a doomed attempt to stop the spread before it even left the dock. It rarely worked for long. A wooden ship packed with crates, ropes and timber joints offered more hiding places than any inspector could realistically check, and the bugs, patient as ever, simply waited out each search in whatever crack was nearest emerging once the ship had already reached open water and there was nowhere left to turn it back to. So if you've ever heard someone describe an old-world charm arriving on these shores centuries ago, it's worth remembering that not everything crossing that ocean was quite so charming, and that a fair number of history's uninvited immigrants had considerably more legs than the ones we usually picture. Naturally, wherever there's a shared enemy this widespread, somebody eventually tries to make a business out of fighting it. And in 1730, a man named John Southall published what historians now consider the very first proper treatise on bedbugs ever written in English, a detailed 44-page manual on how to identify, understand and destroy them. He wrote about the insects with the seriousness of a man who considered himself a genuine authority on the subject, describing their habits, their hiding places and their apparent origins as visitors that in his own words abound in all foreign parts. The story of how Southall actually learned his methods, though, is frankly better than almost anything I could invent for you. While travelling through Kingston, Jamaica, and laid up sick, unable to properly use his own limbs from what he described as a complication of local illnesses, he crossed paths with a man the record only ever describes as one of the first enslaved people brought to the island decades earlier during the era of Oliver Cromwell. Watching Southall scratching miserably at his own bites night after night, this man whose actual name history simply failed to record was reportedly baffled that an Englishman would simply tolerate being bitten instead of doing something effective about it. Why, he apparently asked, would white men let themselves be bitten like that when there was clearly something to be done about it? That question alone was apparently enough to catch Southall's full attention. He had his own reliable method already developed and proven long before Southall ever showed up on that island. In exchange for a bit of tobacco and some coin, he shared it, handing over a small container of his own liquid remedy. Sit with that for a moment because it says something worth saying out loud. The man credited today as the father of English pest control didn't invent his solution at all. He learned it essentially begged for it from someone the historical record barely bothered to name, whose expertise quite plainly outpaced his own by years, maybe decades. Southall went on to sell his own version of the resulting remedy back in London for 2 shillings a bottle, marketed more or less as a secret formula, his own name proudly stamped across the label. It was in an odd way one of the very first pest control businesses in the English-speaking world, and its actual foundation rested on knowledge that was never properly credited where it was actually earned. Back at home, ordinary households couldn't exactly send away to London for a bottled cure, so they made do with whatever was on hand, and honestly some of it sounds almost as dangerous as the bugs themselves. One household guide from the period recommends burning a pound of rolled sulphur directly in an infested room, sealing the door shut with a blanket and getting out as quickly as possible, since the fumes alone could apparently take a person's breath clean away if they lingered too long. Others added a handful of ground pepper straight into the smoke for good measure on the theory that a fiercer smoke made for a more thorough job. Some families built their bed frames specifically from sassafras wood, believing with mixed results that the scent alone might discourage the bugs from settling in. Arsenic, unbelievably, was another common household weapon poured directly into cracks and joints, with far more enthusiasm than caution, in an era before anyone fully understood exactly how dangerous that particular substance really was to the humans sleeping just inches away from it. Would you have gone along with any of that yourself if it meant one uninterrupted night's rest? Honestly, after a long enough stretch of sleepless itching nights, I suspect most of us would have reached for the sulphur-2 fumes and all. Even hospitals took the threat seriously enough to write it into official policy. Nursing staff were formally instructed to search every single bed for fleas and bugs at least once a week, sometimes more, and to strip and sweep the wards on a fixed schedule, windows thrown open during mealtimes to air the whole room out. If you've ever complained about hotel housekeeping being a little slow to change your sheets, this seems like a fairly reasonable moment to feel some honest gratitude. Here's where the story takes a turn I find honestly frustrating, and I think it's worth saying plainly, rather than skipping past. By the early 1800s, naturalists studying these insects began quietly attaching a moral judgment to the whole subject, suggesting that infestations were somehow a mark of poor housekeeping, of a family or a household simply not being clean enough. Two naturalists writing around this time went so far as to describe the spread of these insects as one of the unfortunate side effects that commerce had brought along with its many benefits, a kind of tax paid for progress, and one that fell in their telling mostly on those careless enough to invite it in. It's a tidy, comforting story for anyone who never had the problem themselves. It's also almost completely unsupported by how these insects actually behave. A bedbug does not check your income before it bites you. It has no interest whatsoever in how recently your floors were swept, or how expensive your curtains were, or how many servants your household employed. Wealthy households with feather beds and hired staff dealt with exactly the same infestations as the poorest travellers sleeping on a straw pallet by the fire because the insect itself draws no such distinction and never has. If anything, a wealthy home full of heavy curtains, imported furniture and warm, well-insulated rooms gave the bugs more hiding places to work with, not fewer. Which brings us right back to that ghost story from earlier tonight, doesn't it? An entire legend quietly inherited across 2 centuries, invented specifically to avoid admitting that even the most famous, most celebrated bed in England had exactly the same problem as every simple farmhouse bed nearby. A carpenter's ghost was in the end a far more comfortable story than the truth. Everybody got bitten. The rich simply had better excuses ready and better company willing to believe them. It's a pattern worth noticing beyond just bedbugs, honestly. Whenever a problem is truly universal, touching every level of a society equally, there always seems to be someone eager to reframe it as a personal failing, instead aimed conveniently at whoever has the least power to push back against the accusation. Step back far enough and what you're really looking at is a war that stretched across an entire century, fought nightly in nearly every bed on this side of the ocean and the other, and never once definitively won by either side. Sulphur worked for a night, maybe 2. Arsenic bought a few more weeks. A fresh straw tick freed of its old infested filling offered a brief reprieve before the cycle quietly started over again somewhere new. Nobody in this story, rich or poor, English or colonial, ever actually got to declare victory. They simply got better slowly, generation by generation, at managing an enemy they never fully understood and could never entirely remove. It would take the invention of modern chemical pesticides well over a century later to finally push these insects into genuine retreat across much of the developed world, and even that victory, as recent headlines about their gradual comeback in certain cities remind us, may not turn out to be quite as permanent as anyone would like. In some strange sense, that century-old war never fully ended. It just went quiet for a while. So here's a genuine question worth carrying with you tonight. How much of what we assume about cleanliness and who deserves blame for discomfort is actually just a story we've inherited rather than something we ever properly checked ourselves? It's a question worth remembering because tonight's story is about to turn toward a very different kind of vulnerability, one that had nothing to do with insects hiding in straw and everything to do with who was allowed to feel safe once that candle finally went out, and who had to stay quietly, carefully alert until sunrise instead. That's exactly where we're headed next. A woman named Eliza had a decision to make, and almost everyone around her thought she'd already made the wrong one. It's December of 1783. The War for Independence has finally officially ended the treaty signed only months earlier, ink barely dry, on a peace that had cost the better part of a decade to win. And in Philadelphia, a woman named Elizabeth House Trist, known to her friends simply as Eliza, is preparing to do something that would have raised eyebrows even among the boldest travellers we've already met tonight. Her husband has been building a homestead near Natchez, hundreds of miles to the southwest, for 8 long years through the entire war without her. Now, finally, with the fighting over and the roads at least nominally safer, she intends to go join him. Not by comfortable coach along an established route, since no such route existed for most of it. On horseback overland to Pittsburgh and then down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers by flatboat into territory most Philadelphians of her class had only ever heard described second-hand, if they had heard of it at all. She leaves her 8-year-old son in the care of relatives. She purchases her own horse, and she writes to a dear friend of hers, a fellow Virginian by the name of Thomas Jefferson, laying out the plan. His reply survives, and it's worth hearing exactly as he wrote it. He tells her with obvious affection and just as obvious concern that she will be, in his words, a distinguished creditor if she pursues her wild Mississippi scheme. Even the man who would go on to help engineer the eventual purchase of that same Western territory 2 decades later seemed to think Eliza was being a little reckless. There's a small quiet irony sitting inside that letter, worth noticing if you look for it. Jefferson himself would spend much of his own life imagining and expanding exactly the kind of western frontier Eliza was already riding straight toward alone on horseback, while he stayed comfortably in Philadelphia writing letters of gentle concern about it. She went anyway. Her journal from that trip, kept partly at Jefferson's own request, gives us something rare, an extended first-hand account of exactly what this specific kind of vulnerability actually felt like from the inside, written by a woman who was experiencing it in real time rather than a man simply describing it from a comfortable distance. Some of what she recorded is almost unbearably physical. Crossing through the mountains in brutal winter weather, she wrote of snow piled up to her horse's belly, an image that needs no further explanation to anyone who has ever tried to walk through a deep drift, let alone ride a frightened animal through one. At one lodging house along the way, disgusted by the state of the bedclothes, she chose to sleep in her full travelling clothes, rather than climb beneath the covers directly later, noting simply that she kept her clothes on to keep herself from the dirt on the bedding. Sit with that sentence again. A woman exhausted after a full day's ride decided that staying fully dressed through an entire night was still the more comfortable option weighed against whatever she found waiting for her under those blankets. But it's a smaller, quieter detail from her journal that I find truly remarkable, one that tells you more about her character than almost anything else she wrote. On a stretch of the journey where she was forced to share sleeping space with people well outside her own household, Eliza didn't simply accept the situation and hope for the best. She built her own solution with her own two hands out of whatever happened to be sitting in her own luggage. In her own words, she and her travelling companions ran a little partition along the side of their shared bed and hung their great coats up at the foot of it, which, as she put it, made their berth very private. Think about what that actually is. No carpenter involved, no special equipment, just coats hung with intention, transforming an open shared sleeping space into something closer to a private room, purely through resourcefulness and a bit of quiet determination. Eliza wasn't waiting for the world to hand her privacy. She was quietly constructing it herself out of whatever happened to be within reach, the same practical instinct that got her over a snow-packed mountain pass in the first place. And there's a practical detail buried in her writing that modern audiences tend to miss entirely. Getting dressed for a woman of Eliza's era was not a quick 30-second affair. Layers of undergarments, stays, petticoats, all of it laced, pinned and adjusted in a specific order, often with help from another woman standing right there beside her. Undressing in front of strange men wasn't just uncomfortable. It was quite literally a longer, more exposed process than most of us can easily picture today, minutes of visible effort rather than the quick pull of a nightshirt over the head. Small wonder she and other women went out of their way to find or build some kind of curtain coat or partition before changing for the night. The stakes of exposure were simply higher and took considerably longer to resolve than they would for the men sharing that same room. Now here's a piece of popular imagination worth correcting directly, because I think it does real disservice to how resourceful women like Eliza actually were. A persistent modern myth holds that women in this period simply weren't allowed inside taverns at all, that they used separate doors or stayed away entirely the way certain later saloons famously barred them. If you've ever pictured colonial women fainting at the mere sight of a tavern doorway, I gently ask you to set that image aside. That's not accurate for this particular era. Women absolutely entered, dined in and slept in taverns throughout the 1700s, sometimes even owned and ran them, as we've already touched on tonight. What actually carried restriction wasn't the tavern itself, but specifically the tap room, the noisy male-dominated drinking room where cards, dice and hard liquor tended to concentrate. A respectable woman could rent the parlour, share the common sleeping room, or dine at the same long table as everyone else. She generally was not expected or particularly welcome to linger in that specific drinking corner of the building. It's a narrower, more precise kind of restriction than the myth suggests, and honestly a far more interesting one to actually understand correctly. The line, it turns out, was never drawn around the building. It was drawn around one particular room inside it, and it's worth noting that a solo woman arriving after dark, exactly like the traveller we met earlier tonight, was often met first by another woman, entirely the keeper's wife or daughter, before any male guest even entered the conversation. That first exchange, awkward or blunt as it might have felt in the moment, often functioned as its own quiet screening process. One woman sizing up another, deciding on instinct alone who might need looking after through the night, and who might simply need pointing toward the nearest empty seat by the fire. Still travelling without a male companion carried real social weight, and women of Eliza's class knew it well. It was in the language of the time considered unrespectable, especially for elite women to travel entirely alone. Most brought a relative, a trusted friend, or at minimum another woman for company the way Eliza brought her niece for at least part of her own journey. Not every woman had that luxury though, and their own words make the resulting fear plain. A traveller named Catherine Farham, writing in 1778, described arriving somewhere with no one at all looking out for her interests. She put it simply. She was in great distress, she wrote, but what exactly could she do alone in a public house with no person to take care of her? There's no dramatic flourish in that sentence, no attempt to make the moment sound more thrilling than it actually felt. Just a plain, exhausted admission of exactly how exposed she felt in that particular moment, scrawled quickly, probably by candlelight, likely with her hand still cold from the road. I suspect it's a feeling more than a few people watching this tonight have quietly recognised in far more modern circumstances: a strange hotel room, an unfamiliar city, a door that locks but somehow doesn't feel like quite enough. Wealthier women developed their own workaround for all of this when circumstances allowed it. Rather than risk an unpredictable tavern room entirely, gentry women travelling through settled areas often sought out the private homes of other elite families along their route, instead trading letters of introduction and social connections for a guaranteed more controlled place to sleep. A letter written weeks in advance, a shared acquaintance, a family name recognised up and down the coast, all of it could quietly open a door that an ordinary traveller, male or female, simply didn't have access to. It wasn't available to everyone. It required exactly the kind of social network someone like Eliza Friend to a future president happened to have. But for those who could arrange it, an entire tavern's worth of uncertainty simply evaporated, replaced by a known bed in a known household among people who would at the very least remember your name the next morning. Privacy, in other words, was rarely free in this period. More often it was something you either built yourself out of coats and cloth, the way Eliza did on the road, or purchased in advance through the currency of connections and reputation. Here's something else worth sitting with because it complicates the picture in a way I find honestly interesting. In several important legal respects, women in this exact period actually held more practical authority than they would, a full century later, under Victorian-era law, a fact that tends to surprise people who assume history moves in one steady upward line toward equality. With husbands frequently away at war at sea or building homesteads hundreds of miles off, wives were often left holding power of attorney over the entire household's affairs, their word carrying real legal weight in their husband's continued absence. A woman managing a farm, a shop, or a family's finances for months, sometimes years at a stretch, was simply an accepted fact of colonial life, not an exception worth remarking on. The same society that hesitated to let a woman walk into a tavern unaccompanied might in the very same year trust that same woman to manage land debts and contracts entirely on her own. Vulnerability and authority, it turns out, were sitting right next to each other the whole time, not in some tidy logical order, but tangled together the way most of real history actually tends to be, refusing to fit neatly into the simple story we sometimes want to tell about how far we've supposedly come. Eliza's own journey in the end carried a particularly heavy final chapter. After months on the road, after the coats hung as a makeshift curtain, after the snow and the dirty bedding, and every small negotiation for a little privacy along the way, she finally reached the territory near Natchez, only to learn that her husband had already died before she ever arrived. 8 years of waiting a journey, most of Philadelphia thought reckless, all of it aimed at a reunion that had already quietly become impossible before she'd even crossed the Ohio River. She turned around and made the entire return journey home now as a widow travelling back through the very same uncertain roads, the very same shared beds and borrowed privacy, having risked everything for a homecoming that never happened. It would have been entirely understandable if that were the end of her story, a footnote about a brave, unlucky woman who lost everything for nothing. It wasn't. By her own hand, over 40 more years of life still lay ahead of her, years she went on to fill completely remaining connected to the Jefferson family, for the rest of her days her grandson eventually marrying into that very same family. She had by any honest measure every reason to simply stop taking risks after Natchez. She didn't. If you're looking for a single image to carry with you from her story, let it be this one. A woman who lost the very reason she'd made an impossible journey and kept moving forward anyway, because that's simply what the road and the life waiting on the other side of it required of her. So here's a question worth asking yourself honestly. How much of your own comfort while travelling today, the locked door, the notification if someone tries to enter your room, the simple ability to change your clothes without a second thought, comes from protections you've actually never had to build for yourself? How many of us would even know where to start if we suddenly had only coats and a length of rope to work with? Eliza built her own privacy out of 2 coats and a length of cloth on a riverboat in unfamiliar territory, with nobody coming to help if her solution failed. It's worth remembering that the next time a hotel keycard feels like an inconvenience, rather than the quiet privilege, it actually is a privilege built brick by brick and law by law on the backs of women who once had to solve the exact same problem with whatever happened to be in their luggage. Not every shared bed in this story, though, was about danger or scarcity or making the most of an uncomfortable situation. Somewhere else entirely in this same century, an equally strange custom had families doing the exact opposite, deliberately placing 2 young unmarried people into the very same bed, fully clothed with their own parents' blessing, and sometimes even a wooden board wedged firmly down the middle. That particular story is next. Picture explaining this particular custom to a stranger today. A young couple courting, not yet engaged, tucked into the same bed, fully dressed sometimes with a wooden board wedged firmly between them, while the young woman's own parents sleep in the very same room, near enough to hear every word. Try that sentence out loud sometime. It sounds invented. It wasn't. In November of 1777, a British officer named Thomas Anbury found himself stationed near Cambridge, Massachusetts, a prisoner of war after the surrender at Saratoga, waiting out his captivity among ordinary New England families rather than behind any wall or fence. It's an odd detail worth pausing on by itself. Captured enemy officers in this particular war were sometimes simply billeted with local households on parole, trusted to behave fed at the family table, treated less like prisoners and more like unusual temporary guests. Nobody had quite decided how to categorize. One evening, under the roof of a local household, he was introduced to the family's daughter, a young woman named Jemima, and somewhere in the course of that evening he was invited to bundle with her. Anbury wrote about the experience afterward with the careful, slightly bewildered tone of a foreigner trying to describe a custom his own country had no equivalent for. The purpose, as he understood it, was conversation and warmth, nothing more sanctioned openly by Jemima's own parents, who remained nearby the entire time. He noted the obvious temptation built into the arrangement, and by his own account chose to decline going any further than the custom technically permitted, careful not to compromise the young woman's virtue in a stranger's house, in a stranger's country, on the losing side of a war he hadn't yet finished fighting. Sit with that scene for a moment. An enemy soldier, a captive, invited into a family's home and offered their daughters company for the evening under rules that everyone in the room understood, and he alone had to learn on the spot. It's one of the stranger snapshots of the whole war tucked away in a travel account most people have never heard of, and it tells you something worth remembering about how this custom actually worked. It wasn't secretive, it wasn't shameful, it was ordinary enough that a family felt entirely comfortable extending it to a defeated soldier from the opposing army on the theory that hospitality, in this particular corner of the world ran deeper than politics. We only ever get Ambry's side of that evening, of course, since he's the one who happened to write it down. Jemima left no journal of her own that survives no account of what she made of the enemy officer sitting across the bundling board from her, whether she found him charming, tedious, or simply an interesting break from the usual routine of a New England winter. It's worth remembering, listening to a story like this one, that half the conversation in that room has come down to us only through a single voice, and that the woman actually setting the terms of her own evening rarely got the last word in how the story would eventually be told. So let's actually unpack what bundling was, because the version that survives in modern imagination tends to flatten something that was at the time a fairly structured practice with its own set of tools, rules and expectations. At its simplest, bundling meant a courting couple not yet married sharing a bed for the night, almost always fully clothed. Sometimes that was enough on its own. Often families added a second layer of insurance. A bundling board, a flat wooden plank set upright down the centre of the bed, physically separating the two sides tall enough that neither party could easily roll past it, without waking the entire household in the attempt. Or in some households a bundling bag, a simple sack sewn up the middle, into which the young woman was tucked before the young man ever joined her, leaving him considerably more restricted than she was, his own legs and arms left free while hers stayed carefully contained, and crucially this rarely happened in secret. Parents were typically asleep or pretending to be in the very same room, sometimes the very same house, with paper-thin walls between them, near enough that any real mischief would have been almost impossible to hide. The entire arrangement depended on that supervision. Privacy was never really the point. Conversation was in a household where fuel was expensive. Evenings were dark and a warm shared bed was often the only comfortable place left to actually talk once the fire had burned down for the night and everyone else had already gone to sleep. Now this wasn't some strange isolated New England invention either, whatever the popular imagination tends to assume. Dutch settlers had brought a similar practice with them, sometimes called queesten. Scandinavian communities had their own version, known in some regions as nattfrieri night courting. Welsh and Scottish immigrants carried comparable traditions across the Atlantic as well, each one shaped slightly differently by local custom, but built around the very same basic logic. Bundling, in other words, wasn't an American oddity dreamed up out of nowhere. It was an old European courtship strategy transplanted that simply found unusually fertile ground in the cold winters and scattered farmhouses of colonial New England, where the nearest neighbour might be miles away, and a proper parlour sofa was for most families a luxury nobody could actually afford. If you're watching this from somewhere in Europe tonight, there's a decent chance a version of this same custom once existed in a farmhouse not too far from where you're sitting right now, under a different name quietly forgotten by most families within a generation or two of abandoning it. Naturally, not everyone was comfortable with it, and the resulting arguments tell you almost as much about 18th century society as the custom itself. Around 1756, the more fashionable townspeople of Boston, Salem, Newport, and New York, eager to distinguish themselves from what they now considered their rougher, more rustic ancestors, began forbidding their own daughters from bundling, entirely introducing the sofa instead as a properly polite alternative for courting couples to sit rather than lie together. It's a small telling detail about how class worked in this period. The very same behaviour that counted as perfectly respectable in a farmhouse outside Hartford could suddenly become scandalous the moment it crossed into fashionable city drawing rooms, not because anything about human nature had changed, but because respectability itself was shifting city by city, decade by decade. Out in the countryside, the custom held on considerably longer, and its defenders could be fierce. The Reverend Samuel Peters, writing in 1781, offered one of the more spirited defences on record, arguing that bundling had already prevailed in New England for a full 160 years, tracing all the way back to the very first Puritan settlements, and insisting in his own words that it produced far more real chastity than a sofa ever could. He was careful to add a caveat, noting that anyone motivated purely by lust rather than sincere courtship had no business bundling at all. It's a strikingly modern argument. Honestly, the idea that a practice itself isn't inherently dangerous, only the intentions someone brings into it. And in 1776, one visiting clergyman from a fashionable town made the mistake of travelling out to the country and preaching directly against the custom from the pulpit, calling it, from what survives of the account, an unchristian habit, unbecoming of decent young people. He didn't get far past the church doors before a group of local women confronted him, outright demanding to know whether he thought they and their daughters were somehow immoral simply for allowing it. When he tried to argue that bundling led people into temptation, they didn't back down. They pointed out quite pointedly that his own information likely came from city women who preferred the sofa, women whose own children they noted, with obvious satisfaction, arrived rather suspiciously soon after certain weddings. It's a wonderful piece of historical sass, honestly. Ordinary rural women standing their ground against a visiting minister, armed with nothing but their own confidence, and a well-aimed observation about hypocrisy in front of the entire congregation he'd just finished lecturing. Here's where I want to be honest with you, rather than simply charming though, because the real history deserves both. Bundling's defenders insisted the custom preserved chastity. The actual record is a good deal messier than that. Historians studying birth records from this exact period estimate that as many as 1/3 of New England couples had already conceived their first child before their wedding day, whatever the intended rules of bundling were supposed to prevent. That's not a small margin. That's roughly one wedding in 3 quietly following a pregnancy rather than preceding one. That's not necessarily proof the custom failed, though. It might just as easily suggest something else entirely. In a community small enough that everyone already knew who was courting whom, bundling may have functioned less as a strict chastity test and more as a socially accepted semi-public step on the road toward a marriage that was quietly expected to happen anyway. Everyone in that farmhouse, parents included, generally already knew this particular young man and woman were headed toward the altar. Bundling simply gave them a sanctioned, supervised way to spend time together while that outcome slowly became official. If a couple did go further than intended, and a child eventually followed the fact that they'd been formally openly bundling together, already established in the eyes of the entire community exactly who was responsible for what came next. There was no mystery to solve, no scandal to hide, because the courtship itself had never been secret in the first place. In its own strange way, the custom built in a kind of accountability, even when it failed at the thing it was officially designed to prevent functioning, almost like an informal, socially enforced version of what a modern court might call an admission of paternity. Now here's the twist in this story that I suspect very few people watching tonight have ever heard, and it's the reason bundling actually belongs in this particular video at all, rather than a completely different one about courtship customs. Bundling wasn't only for young lovers. Under exactly the same scarcity of beds, we've spent this entire video discussing some households extended the very same arrangement to travellers. A period dictionary from the early 1800s records the custom, plainly defining it as a man and woman sharing a bed, he in his own small clothes, she in her petticoats, described specifically as a practical expedient used in America whenever beds ran short. On those occasions, the dictionary notes husbands and fathers would sometimes permit an arriving traveller, a total stranger, passing through to bundle for the night, with their own wife or daughter, fully clothed purely as a workable solution to an ordinary housing shortage. Think about how that reframes everything we've already covered tonight. This wasn't a wild exception to how tavern life worked. It was the exact same underlying logic we've traced through nearly every part of this story so far. Private space simply didn't exist the way we assume it should, and families, innkeepers and travellers alike found their own workable, socially accepted ways to manage a world with far fewer beds than people who needed them. A stranger sharing a bed with a farmer's wife for the sake of warmth and space wasn't scandalous in this world. It was simply Tuesday, filed under exactly the same practical logic as two strangers sharing a rope bed at a crowded tavern, or a courting couple sharing one with a plank between them. If you're sitting there slightly stunned by that, you're allowed to be. I certainly was the first time I came across it properly documented. We tend to imagine courtship history and travel history as two entirely separate stories filed away on different shelves in different books. In colonial New England, apparently they occasionally shared the very same bed, quite literally, under the very same set of rules, governed by the very same practical shortage that has run underneath nearly every story we've told tonight. So here's a question worth turning over for a moment before we move on. How many of our own modern taboos, the ones that feel completely obvious and unquestionable to us right now, might look every bit this strange, this negotiable, to someone watching a video like this? 250 years from tonight. What would they find themselves honestly surprised we ever considered normal? The custom faded gradually rather than all at once tightened parlours, proper courting sofas and a rising Victorian discomfort, with mixed company slowly pushing it out of fashion through the early 1800s. By the time your own great-great-great-grandparents were courting in most parts of New England, at least the whole practice had already quietly become something older relatives whispered about, rather than something anyone actually still did. But for well over a century in ordinary farmhouses across New England, and in more than a few crowded tavern rooms besides a wooden board down the middle of a shared bed, was simply how families handled two of their biggest problems at once: not enough fuel and not enough beds. Which brings us to the people actually running these households and these taverns in the first place. Because those same sharp-tongued women who stood their ground against a visiting minister over bundling weren't only defending a courtship custom that night. They were defending their own authority over their own homes, an authority that, as it turns out, extended far beyond the bedroom and right into the business of running an entire tavern, from the ground up, from the front door to the ledger book to the license hanging on the wall. That story is next. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because they tend to surprise people more than almost anything else in this entire story. By some estimates, roughly 2 out of every 3 taverns operating across colonial America during the very century we've spent tonight exploring were owned or managed by women, most of them widows. Not a token handful, not a rare exception worth a footnote, a genuine majority running the exact rooms, beds and tap rooms every single person we've talked about tonight has passed through. Take a moment with that number. If you'd asked most people to guess before tonight who actually ran the average colonial tavern, how many would have pictured a woman standing behind that bar rather than a man? I suspect not many. And yet the paperwork tells a very different story than the one popular imagination tends to hand down. There was even a word for it, an old English term almost nobody uses anymore. An alewife, a woman who kept a house where ale was both brewed and sold. Some alewives developed their own specialties. One recipe brewed specifically stronger than usual, and known as groaning beer, was kept on hand purely to comfort women during childbirth, the tavern doubling quietly as something like a maternity ward on especially difficult nights. It's a small detail, but it tells you something important. These weren't women simply minding a business somebody else had built. They were shaping the entire trade around the actual needs of their own communities, including needs that male keepers and male historians afterward rarely thought to write down at all. Why so many widows specifically? The honest answer involves both compassion and self-interest tangled together, the way most colonial policy tended to be. Local governments truly worried about widows falling into poverty and becoming a financial burden on the town, so licensing officials actively steered tavern keeping toward women who'd lost a husband and needed a respectable, reliable way to support themselves and their children. It solved two problems with one signature. A widow gained a livelihood. The town avoided a welfare case, a line item quietly kept off the local budget, but calling it purely charity would be selling these women considerably short. Plenty of them turned modest inheritances into genuine lasting enterprises, expanding a single license into real property, real influence, and in more than a few cases considerable local standing that outlasted their husbands by decades. One woman's story in particular deserves far more attention than history has generally given her. Her name was Anna Dix Bingham, and if I told you her life story as a single uninterrupted arc, you might assume I was exaggerating for effect. I promise you, I am not. Anna's early years gave no hint of the reputation she would eventually build. Born in Watertown, Massachusetts, unusually well educated for a woman of her time, she found herself in 1765 convicted of a charge that would have followed most colonial women for the rest of their days, having had a child outside of marriage. In a small, tightly knit, Puritan-influenced town, a conviction like that carried real lasting weight, the kind of mark neighbours rarely let a woman fully outrun. 2 months later she married. It was not by any measure a promising or scandal-free beginning, and if you had stopped Anna's story right there on paper, you would have every reason to assume it stayed a quiet, diminished one. And yet look at where that same woman ended up. In 1773, Anna and her second husband, Silas Bingham, opened a general store in the small town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Within a couple of years, the store had expanded into a full tavern and inn, the kind of establishment we've spent this entire video walking through a stagecoach stop between Boston and Albany, offering beds, meals, and stable space to every traveller passing through this particular stretch of Berkshire County. Then, in 1781, Silas died, and Anna, rather than stepping aside or handing the business off to some male relative as convention might have suggested, became the first woman in the entire recorded history of Berkshire County to hold a liquor license in her own name. She wasn't managing on someone else's paper anymore. The license itself was hers. Now here's where her story stops being simply admirable and becomes remarkably historic in a way that still surprises people today. In the winter of 1786, a farmer named Daniel Shays led an armed uprising against the Massachusetts government, furious over crushing debt-aggressive tax collection and a court system that seemed to protect wealthy creditors, while ordinary farmers lost their land, their livestock, sometimes their entire livelihood over debts. Many of them had accumulated simply trying to survive the economic chaos left behind by the War for Independence. It became known as Shays' Rebellion, one of the most serious internal threats the young United States faced in its first decade of independence, an uprising significant enough that it directly influenced the drafting of the Constitution the following year, as the founders scrambled to build a stronger federal government capable of responding to exactly this kind of crisis, one the fragile Articles of Confederation had proven powerless to handle. And the headquarters for that rebellion, the building where organizing, planning and gathering actually took place, was Anna Bingham's own tavern. Picture that for a second. A woman who had already survived public scandal and widowhood now found armed rebels using her taproom as a staging ground for an uprising against her own state government, her business quite literally sitting at the center of a genuine constitutional crisis. men with muskets planning strategy over her own ale, in the very same room where stagecoach passengers had been eating supper only weeks before. Whatever she thought of the politics involved, and there's no clean record of her personal opinion on the matter, her tavern had become, whether she asked for the role or not, one of the more consequential buildings in all of Massachusetts, that particular winter watched closely by a state government desperate to know exactly what was being planned inside it. She didn't fold afterward either. If anything, the years following the rebellion show a woman expanding her ambitions rather than retreating from them, even as the eyes of an entire county remained fixed on her business for what it had witnessed. Anna diversified. She joined a group of Berkshire investors purchasing land shares in townships out in New York, the only woman among them sitting at a table of men making exactly the kind of speculative business decisions women of her era were rarely even invited to consider. She ran a separate store out of her own home on top of the tavern itself. In 1793 she hosted the very first annual meeting of the Stockbridge Library Society, helping seed one of the earliest libraries anywhere in western Massachusetts. A woman who'd once been formally punished by the law, now quietly building one of her community's lasting institutions of learning, the kind of civic legacy rarely attributed to a tavern keeper of either gender. And then comes the detail that, in my honest opinion, deserves to be far better known than it currently is. Anna's growing business interest eventually pulled her into a financial dispute with an entrepreneur named Thomas Jenkins, involving loaned securities and unpaid debts, among several Berkshire businessmen, Anna included. The dispute escalated. It went to court. It was appealed, and it kept climbing all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, not once, but twice, in two separate cases, in the 1790s, at a moment when that court itself was barely a decade old, still working out what its own authority and procedures would even look like, which makes Anna Dix Bingham, as far as the historical record shows, the first woman ever to appear as a litigant before the Supreme Court of the United States. Not a spectator, not a footnote in someone else's case, a named party with a real financial stake in the outcome, standing before the highest court in a country that in nearly every other legal respect still treated married women as barely able to hold property in their own name. Sit with that for a moment, because it's worth letting land properly. A woman whose life began with a public conviction for something considered deeply shameful in her own time ended up making genuine legal history at the very highest court the country had, decades before women could vote, decades before most states even recognized a married woman's independent right to sue or be sued at all. One biography of her put it plainly, describing how she conducted herself, quote, as professionally as any man buying and selling goods, signing notes, suing and being sued in the courts, posting bond and complaining out loud when she felt wronged. That last detail might be my favourite part of the whole description, honestly. She didn't just do the work, she made sure everyone around her knew exactly how she felt about it, and apparently never much cared who was listening. Here's a question worth turning over in your mind for a moment. How many women like Anna are sitting quietly in old county records right now, their names attached to a liquor license or a court filing, waiting for someone to actually connect the dots of their entire life the way we just did? History tends to remember the scandal at the beginning of a story far more readily than the achievement at its end. It's a far easier, tidier narrative to repeat a woman punished, a lesson learned, the story finished. Anna's story is a useful reminder of exactly how lopsided that habit can be, and how much gets left out when we only bother reading the first chapter of somebody's life. Her story wasn't entirely unique either, even if the Supreme Court detail certainly was. Widows across the colonies fought for and won licenses in their own name throughout this same period. One woman in Yorktown successfully petitioned a court to transfer her late husband's license directly into her own name, rather than allowing it to lapse or pass to some more distant male relative. Another placed a notice in the Virginia Gazette after her own husband's death, informing the public that she intended to keep her house running exactly as before for any gentleman or lady who cared to favour her with their custom, a small but firm announcement that business would continue grief or no grief. It's worth remembering too that Sarah, the very woman whose journey opened this entire video, went on to run her own tavern and inn in New London, later in her own life joining the same trade she'd once simply passed through as an exhausted traveller on that first cold night we spent together. The woman who once lay awake listening to strangers argue about a name eventually became the person deciding who got a bed and who got the floor in a house of her own. By the 1770s, in fact, women held roughly a third of all tavern licenses granted in a city as significant as Boston, the overwhelming majority of them widows rebuilding a livelihood out of whatever their husbands had left behind. This wasn't some quiet, marginal footnote to colonial commerce. It was for a while simply how a very large share of the hospitality trade actually worked. That balance didn't hold forever though, and the reason it shifted says something a little less flattering about how respectability tends to work. As the decades passed, tavern keeping increasingly doubled as a stepping stone into local politics. Keepers elected as selectmen, militia officers, and town justices, their tap rooms functioning as informal campaign headquarters and neighbourhood gathering points that carried real influence come election season. Once the role started carrying real political weight, men began crowding back in, and licensing officials perhaps unconsciously started favouring them. By 1770, in one populous Massachusetts county, only a small fraction of new licenses went to widows at all. A sharp reversal from decades earlier, when a widow's application had been treated almost as the expected sensible outcome. The very same job once considered a practical charity extended to vulnerable women quietly became too prestigious to leave to them once real influence was attached to it. It's a pattern worth noticing well beyond taverns, honestly. Time and again, across very different industries and very different centuries, work performed almost entirely by women unpaid, underpaid, or barely tolerated has had a habit of suddenly attracting far more male competition the moment it started paying real money or carrying real status. You can find echoes of that same pattern in plenty of modern industries too if you know where to look for them. Anna Bingham simply happened to be running her business during the tail end of the window where women could still walk through that particular door without a fight. So here's a question worth sitting with as we move forward tonight. If Anna Bingham's own tavern could host both a full-blown armed rebellion and the group that eventually launched a landmark Supreme Court case, what exactly was actually served at her table on an ordinary Tuesday evening in between all that history quietly happening around it? Because for every rebellion and every court filing, there was still a hungry traveller walking through that same door every single night, expecting supper, entirely unaware of or entirely indifferent to whatever else that particular tavern might one day be remembered for. That's exactly where we're headed next. Funny enough, the answer to that question starts with a word we've technically already used tonight, just in a completely different context. Remember groaning beer that stronger brew alewives kept ready to comfort a woman through childbirth? It turns out the word groaning had a second life in the kitchen too. A groaning board originally meant something remarkably similar, a table of food specifically prepared for a household around the time a baby arrived piled high enough to feed a house full of relatives, midwives and well-wishers all crowded in at once. Only later did the phrase drift toward its more familiar modern meaning, any table so loaded with food that the wooden boards themselves seemed to creak and groan under the weight of it, whether or not anyone in the household happened to be expecting. Two different traditions tucked inside the exact same word, both circling back to the same idea. abundance shared out loud for an audience that needed comfort. I find that a wonderfully tidy little coincidence sitting quietly inside English vocabulary this whole time, waiting for someone to notice it. Language, it turns out, keeps its own kind of history folded into words we use every day, without a second thought about where they actually came from. So let's actually sit down at that table, because supper at a colonial tavern operated by rules most of us have never had to think about. There was no menu. None. You didn't choose your meal so much as accept whatever the household happened to be cooking that particular day, served at a fixed hour for a fixed price set by law, exactly the arrangement we touched on earlier tonight when we talked about what an ordinary actually was. Breakfast typically landed around 9 in the morning, later than you might expect, and might include ham-salted fish pancakes, toasted bread and coffee, or tea, depending entirely on what the household had on hand that particular week. Supper came from wide shared bowls set down the centre of the table, plates and spoons, doing double duty across the whole room, and if you wanted a decent portion, you learned quickly not to wait politely for someone to offer it to you first. Hesitation at a table like that simply meant going hungry. Meat was almost always heavily salted, a practical necessity, in an age with no refrigeration whatever the season and region happened to provide. Beef, veal, mutton, duck, turkey, salmon, oysters, lobster, all of it possible, none of it guaranteed on any given night. Shellfish, oddly enough to modern ears, was often considered more desirable than plain fish. A small reversal of taste that says something about how differently abundance and scarcity worked in a world before commercial fishing fleets, back when oysters were cheap enough to be considered common fare rather than a delicacy reserved for special occasions. Rural taverns, generally speaking, offered simpler fare than their city cousins, closer to whatever the keeper's own family happened to be eating that week than to any distinct restaurant-style menu. City taverns with more customers and more competition tended to stretch a little further, advertising in local newspapers promising better cuts of meat or a wider selection of imported wine to travellers who had a genuine choice of where to spend their evening. Out on a lonely stretch of country road, though, you rarely had that luxury. You ate what the house was already cooking, and you were quietly grateful it was cooking anything at all. Sarah, our traveller from earlier tonight, ran straight into the limits of the system on her way toward Rye. Hungry after a long day's ride, walking part of the distance herself, while leading her tired horse up a punishing hill, she asked the French family running that particular ordinary for a fricassee. What arrived in her own later description was managed so far outside her own idea of proper cooking that she simply gave up and went to bed without eating at all, climbing a stairway so narrow she nearly couldn't fit through it, into a cramped little room stuffed with mismatched furniture, and by her own account a mattress that rustled underneath her like straw pulled fresh from a barn. It's a small, almost throwaway complaint in her journal buried between larger dramas, but it tells you something real. Even a paying guest, even someone with money in hand and a legitimate legal right to a fixed-price meal, had no actual control over what showed up on the plate or whether it would be edible once it did. The law could regulate the price of your supper. It could not regulate whether the cook actually knew what a fricassee was supposed to taste like. We do have at least one hard number from this exact period worth holding on to, since specific prices from this world rarely survive intact. In 1766, a travelling man named John Tripp and his wife paid 6 shillings for a single night's lodging at an inn in Barrington, Rhode Island, a price fixed well in advance of their arrival, the same amount any other traveller passing through. That same week would have paid rich or poor satisfied with their fricassee or not. Now, if the food was a gamble, the drink was practically guaranteed and considerably more interesting to talk about. Water in this period carried real risk, often drawn from sources nobody could properly test contaminated, more often than anyone at the time fully understood, so alcohol filled a role considerably larger than simple enjoyment. It was in a very real sense the safer beverage. Hard apple cider was so common and so trusted that some households actually used it as a form of payment, trading jugs of it. The way we might hand over cash today, a farmhand's wages sometimes settled partly in barrels rather than coin. Ale and cider dominated the earlier decades of the century. By the 1770s, rum had firmly taken over as the drink of choice across most colonial taverns, cheap, plentiful, and shipped in by the barrel from the Caribbean sugar trade, part of a much larger, considerably darker economic system, tying together sugar slavery and shipping across 3 continents. Cold weather brought its own specialties: a hot toddy whiskey mixed with hot water lemon sugar, and a bit of clove warmed travellers through a long winter evening, the steam rising off the mug almost as welcome as the drink itself after a day on frozen roads. An even stranger concoction called flip combined hot beer, rum, molasses, and eggs or cream, all of it stirred together sometimes with a red-hot iron poker, plunged directly into the mug to make it froth and steam, on the spot filling the whole tap room with the smell of scorched sugar and hot spirits. If you've ever complained about a barista overcomplicating a simple coffee order, I gently suggest Flip puts that particular modern complaint in perspective. The sheer scale of colonial drinking is honestly staggering by today's standards. By 1770, per capita consumption of distilled spirits alone had reached roughly 3.5 gallons a year for every adult, a number that would keep climbing for decades afterward. Spread out across a year, that works out to something near 2 modest drinks a day, every single day for the average adult colonist, well before anyone had coined a phrase like moderate drinking, or thought to question whether starting the morning with a drink counted as unusual at all. Drinking, though, was rarely a private affair, and this is where the tavern's social machinery really kicked into gear. Toasting or drinking healths, as it was often called, functioned as practically a national pastime. You didn't simply raise a glass. You raised it to somebody honouring a friend, a cause, or occasionally a very pointed political opinion dressed up as good manners, everyone at the table watching closely to see who got named and who quietly got skipped. Benjamin Franklin, a man we've already spent a fair amount of time with tonight, once offered one of the more famous toasts of the era, in a private letter, remarking in his own roundabout way that a divine hand shaping wine into being was proof enough that a higher power wanted to see people happy. It's often misquoted today as being about beer instead of wine, which tells you something about how thoroughly that particular sentiment has outlived its original wording, repeated by people who have never once seen the actual letter it came from. Political toasts in particular carried real weight in the years leading up to and through the Revolution. Patrons raised glasses to freedom from mobs and kings. They toasted with considerably less generosity, wishing the enemies of American liberty a total shortage of good beef and good wine, a curse dressed up as a drinking game. When peace finally arrived in 1783, celebrating crowds in towns across the new nation drank a full round of 13 separate toasts, one for each of the original states, carefully counted and recorded by newspaper editors, keeping track of exactly how far the celebration went. It was a tradition so well loved it quietly became a fixture of every Independence Day celebration for years afterward, an artillery salute and 3 cheers, usually following right behind the last raised glass. Authorities understandably found all of this considerably harder to control than they would have liked. A Boston judge named Samuel Sewall tried in 1714 to personally break up a particularly rowdy tavern gathering and send everyone home for the night. He failed completely, unable to convince the room to budge, a sitting judge simply outnumbered and out-argued by a table full of determined drinkers who saw no reason to cut their evening short for him. And it wasn't only the drinking itself that worried colonial officials either. Toasting specifically precisely because it doubled as a socially acceptable excuse to gather in large opinionated groups occasionally drew the attention of governors nervous about exactly what kind of political sentiment might be brewing along with the beer. In several colonies, officials at different points actually attempted to restrict or discourage the practice of toasting outright, not because a raised glass itself posed any danger, but because a room full of people raising glasses together had an unfortunate habit of turning into a room full of people agreeing on something the government would rather they hadn't discussed at all. There's something almost funny about that particular anxiety, honestly. A government trying to legislate away a drinking toast not because of the alcohol itself, but because of what people might say to each other while holding the glass. It rarely worked. Taverns, as we've already spent a good portion of tonight establishing, were simply too woven into the fabric of daily life to be regulated out of existence by a single unpopular rule. And if you're picturing a nicely orderly dinner scene right now, mugs quietly raised, polite conversation drifting across the table, I should mention that at least one traveller through these exact taverns, our own Dr. Hamilton from earlier tonight, noted that guests were more or less expected to match the drinking pace of whoever was hosting the evening, or risk being seen as rude for holding back. Refusing a round wasn't simply declining a drink. It was in its own small way an insult to the entire table, the kind of social misstep that could follow a traveller's reputation down the road to the very next tavern. So here's a question worth turning over for a moment. How much of what we now call peer pressure, the quiet social cost of being the one person at the table not drinking, actually traces back centuries further than any of us usually assume? Have you ever found yourself ordering one more round purely because everyone else at the table already had, even when you would have rather stopped? The tavern didn't invent that particular discomfort. It just happened to be where an enormous number of colonial Americans practiced it night after night, glass after glass, long before anyone had a name for the feeling at all. There's a strange kind of double life running through this whole part of tonight's story if you step back and look at it properly. The exact same shared table that pulled strangers together, farmer and merchant, local and traveller, toasting the same cause with the same mug of flip, could just as easily curdle into exactly the kind of tension that worried men like Sewall in the first place. Drink loosened tongues in both directions. It built friendships across a crowded taproom in one breath, and it started arguments, grudges, and the occasional outright brawl in the next. The tavern table never fully decided which version of the evening it wanted to be, and most nights it simply ended up being both. Picture the smell of it all for a moment, since we've spent so much time on the taste. Wood smoke curling up from the hearth, roasting meat, spilled ale soaking into a bare wooden floor, hot spiced rum drifting over from somebody's mug of flip. It's the kind of atmosphere no candle or air freshener has ever quite managed to bottle, since thick, warm, and entirely unavoidable the moment you step through the door. By the time supper wound down and the last toast had been drunk, though, the night wasn't necessarily over, and neither was the danger. Because stepping back outside that warm, crowded taproom, a little unsteady, a little too loud, a little too pleased with yourself, was exactly the moment the road itself became considerably less forgiving. That's exactly where we're headed next. Let's be honest about something first. Everything we've covered so far tonight, the itching, the crowded beds, the questionable fricassee, all of it was uncomfortable. None of it was actually likely to get you killed. What we're about to cover is a different category of story entirely. Picture a wide open stretch of heath just outside London, gorse and scrub stretching out on either side of a rutted dirt road. No houses in sight, no witnesses for miles. Just a cold breeze moving through low bushes, and the distant sound of a horse's hooves that might belong to a fellow traveller or might not. For roughly 100 years, stretching across the 1600s and well into the 1700s, this particular kind of landscape turned a simple journey between towns into a genuine gamble. Hounslow Heath on the western edge of London earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous stretches of ground in the whole country, a place wealthy travellers heading toward the fashionable resorts of the West Country learned to dread long before they ever reached it, sometimes hiring extra guards or timing their journey specifically to cross it in broad daylight in the company of as many other travellers as they could gather. The men waiting along roads like this one had a name that survived far better than most of them individually did: highwaymen. And the gap between how popular culture remembers them and how they actually operated is frankly one of the more useful corrections I can offer you tonight. It's worth asking why this particular danger flourished exactly when it did. Part of the answer traces back to England's own civil war decades earlier, which left a good number of trained soldiers suddenly without an army, a wage, or any obvious trade to fall back into once the fighting stopped. Combine that with a newly invented, easily concealed flintlock pistol, vast stretches of open, unpoliced countryside, and a growing number of wealthy travellers actually worth robbing, and you have almost every ingredient this particular crime wave needed all arriving within a few decades of one another. Take the most famous name in the entire trade, a man called Dick Turpin. If you've heard of him at all, you probably picture a dashing figure in a long coat, galloping through the night on a legendary horse, robbing the wealthy with a wink and a tip of the hat before vanishing into the dark. That image owes almost everything to novelists writing a full century after Turpin was already dead, and almost nothing to the actual historical record. The real Turpin was born in Hempstead, Essex in 1706, and trained as a butcher before drifting into a considerably rougher line of work, first as part of a gang of poachers and thieves, later escalating into armed robbery and worse. He operated for years out of a real physical base, the Old Swan Inn, in a small village in Buckinghamshire, using the tavern the exact same way any other traveller might for a bed, a meal and a place to plan his next move, except his plans tended to involve robbery rather than commerce. He was eventually captured, tried and hanged in York in 1739, his grave still visible today in a local churchyard, a fairly unremarkable end for a man who would go on to become the single most famous criminal in English folklore. Nothing in that biography particularly resembles a charming rogue. What made Turpin famous wasn't his own behaviour. It was a novel written decades after his death, one that quietly rewrote a violent, opportunistic criminal into folk legend the same way plenty of dangerous historical figures eventually get smoothed over, once enough time and enough fiction stands between us and the actual consequences of what they did. It's worth asking yourself honestly, how many other figures from history you've absorbed as charming or romantic purely because somebody wrote a good story about them, generations after anyone who actually knew them was still alive to object. Here's where tonight's story loops directly back to everything we've already spent hours discussing. Taverns and inns weren't simply places highwaymen occasionally passed through. For more than a few of them, an inn was headquarters exactly the way Turpin used the Old Swan. A quiet country tavern tucked well off the main road offered everything a man in his particular line of work actually needed. Stable space to hide a fast horse ready for a quick escape, a private room to lie low in after a robbery out of sight until the immediate search for him died down, a network of regulars who might for the right price or simply out of local loyalty stay quiet about who was actually staying upstairs. Even today, an old coaching inn in Wallingford still advertises its claimed connection to Turpin, a highwayman's shadow, apparently good for business. 2.5 centuries later, whatever it did to the inn's actual reputation at the time, it's a strange kind of afterlife. A building trading on the exact same danger that would have terrified its actual 18th century guests, now turned into a marketing detail on a modern menu. This put honest tavern keepers in a truly difficult position. We already know a license could be pulled for harbouring known troublemakers. Knowingly sheltering an actual highwayman put an entire livelihood at risk, yet turning away a paying, well-armed guest who simply hadn't announced his profession wasn't always a realistic option for a keeper trying to survive a slow season. Suspicion alone wasn't proof, and proof out on an isolated country road, with no organised police force to call, was in desperately short supply. A keeper might honestly have no idea right up until the moment the local magistrate came asking uncomfortable questions. Ordinary travellers, meanwhile, developed their own quiet rituals of fear and their own workarounds which tell you more about daily reality than any highwayman's legend ever could. A German scholar named von Uffenbach, travelling near London in 1710, wrote candidly about riding home late one night, in what he called considerable terror of being robbed, startled by the realization that even this near the capital of a supposedly civilized kingdom nobody could actually guarantee his safety on the road after dark. It's a small human detail, a visiting academic presumably more used to libraries than danger, suddenly acutely aware of every shadow along the road home. The famous adventurer Casanova, passing through England some decades later, took the threat seriously enough to split his money before setting out tucking a portion of his coins into a separate purse, specifically meant to be handed over quickly. If he was stopped, a kind of small sacrificial offering meant to end the encounter fast without the delay and danger of a highwayman searching further and finding the rest. Other travellers of the period had boots specially made with hidden cavities carved into the heel, a place to tuck a little extra money where a hurried search wouldn't necessarily find it. Some travellers reportedly carried a mix of good coin and worthless clipped or counterfeit money, hoping to hand over the bad currency first and talk their way out of producing anything better. None of that, by the way, guaranteed anything. If a highwayman came up empty-handed after a first search, plenty simply searched again more thoroughly, considerably less politely the second time around. If you'd been riding that same road yourself in that same year, which of those small precautions do you think you'd have trusted most? The split purse, the hidden boot heel, or simply riding fast and hoping for the best? The financial system built up around catching these men tells you something too about just how seriously the threat was actually taken at an official level. Rewards climbed depending on exactly who you managed to catch and where. Roughly £40 for the arrest of a highwayman caught attacking a stagecoach. £200, a truly enormous sum for most people of the era, easily several years of an ordinary labourer's wages for capturing anyone who robbed the mail, specifically since interfering with the post carried its own separate weight of seriousness. And as much as £300 if the arrest happened within 5 miles of London itself, the government apparently far more anxious about crime near the capital than anywhere further out. Turnpike keepers along major roads were even equipped with speaking trumpets, a crude but effective early warning system meant to shout word ahead the moment a robbery was spotted, giving nearby travellers a chance to prepare or turn back before riding straight into danger themselves. It rarely worked cleanly, though. Life on the road for a highwayman was short and violent by nature. Historians estimate the average working highwayman survived only into his late 20s before being caught killed in a robbery gone wrong or simply vanishing from the record entirely. Capture usually ended in a public hanging the body afterward, left displayed in a metal cage near the very road where the crimes had taken place, a grim, deliberately visible warning to the next man tempted by the same trade. 3 brothers working the roads around Oxfordshire met exactly this fate together, in the 1780s hanged, and then gibbeted from an old oak tree, their bodies left as a lesson for anyone still considering the profession. It's a far cry from the charming folk hero popular songs eventually turned these men into. But here's something worth sitting with because I think it gets honestly overlooked. For every traveller who lost sleep worrying about a highwayman on a lonely stretch of heath, a far larger number of colonial families lost everything to a threat with considerably less romance attached to it and almost no ballads written in its honour. Fire. Nearly every tavern in this story was built from wood lit by open candle flame heated by an unenclosed hearth, burning at the centre of a crowded, noisy room full of drunk, tired, occasionally careless guests. Only the wealthiest households could afford proper brick or stone construction. Everyone else built with timber plaster and thatch materials that went up fast and burned faster. Picture the fire risk stacked in layers the way we've already pictured a colonial bed. Dry straw ticks on nearly every mattress. Fabric hangings around the finer beds. Spilled spirits soaked into bare wooden floorboards. Loose candles carried from room to room by tired travellers who'd already been drinking for hours. Every single ingredient a serious fire needs sitting together in one crowded room nearly every single night, waiting on nothing more than a single unwatched candle or a stray ember rolling off the hearth. Archaeologists digging in North Carolina uncovered exactly this kind of story a few years ago. A tavern built by a mariner in the mid-1700s, operating for roughly 30 years before an accidental fire tore through it and burned it to the ground. The blaze was devastating enough that the walls actually collapsed inward, sealing an entire layer of daily tavern life tools, pipes, mugs, personal belongings beneath the wreckage like a time capsule nobody intended to bury. It sat there undisturbed for well over 2 centuries until modern researchers finally uncovered it, piecing together an entire vanished business from the ash and broken pottery left behind in a single catastrophic afternoon. Unlike a highwayman, fire didn't announce itself with a pistol and a demand. It simply arrived quietly from a source so ordinary that nobody thought twice about it, until it was already too late to stop. No amount of caution, no split purse, no hidden boot heel could fully protect a family from a stray spark finding dry straw at exactly the wrong moment. So here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had to bet on which danger cost more people their days across this entire century, the highwayman with his pistol and his folk legend, or the candle left burning a little too near a straw-filled mattress, which would you actually put your money on? I suspect the quiet, unglamorous answer is the one that never got a single ballad written about it at all. We remember the dramatic threat. We tend to forget the mundane one, even when the mundane one was doing considerably more damage the whole time. It's the same instinct, honestly, that makes a plane crash feel more frightening than the drive to the airport, even though the numbers tell a very different story. And yet for all of that real danger on the road, real risk under the very roof meant to shelter you, people kept travelling anyway. They kept walking through that same tavern door night after night, because whatever waited on the other side of it, uncertain beds, questionable suppers, the occasional highwayman, the constant threat of an open flame. The alternative was simply staying home. And staying home was never really an option for the merchants, the messengers, the soldiers, and the ordinary families this entire century depended on to keep moving. A road this dangerous and people still filled it every single day. That tells you something about how badly this young sprawling world needed to stay connected, whatever the cost of connection turned out to be. Which brings us to the final piece of tonight's story, the part where all of this, the danger, the community, the shared beds and shared meals, actually adds up to something far bigger than any single tavern ever intended to become. That story is next. Remember that pin we stuck in the map earlier tonight? The tavern in Boston kept for years under the sign of a green dragon that I promised we'd come back to before the night was through. This is that moment. By the 1760s, a modest tavern on a narrow lane in Boston's North End had quietly become something its original keepers could never have planned for. Its upstairs rooms belonged to a Masonic lodge. Its basement belonged to something considerably more dangerous. Down there in a plain room full of the exact same rough tables, shared benches and mismatched mugs, we've spent this entire night describing a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, began meeting on a regular basis alongside Boston's Committee of Correspondence and a local political group known simply as the Caucus. It was in that basement, by most accounts, that the plan for the Boston Tea Party actually came together in the winter of 1773. Men who would go on to become household names, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere, sat at an ordinary tavern table and quietly decided to throw a fortune in British tea into Boston Harbour, disguising themselves before ever leaving the building. 2 years later, when Paul Revere set out on his famous midnight ride, warning that British troops were on the move toward Lexington and Concord, the alert reportedly reached him at this exact same building, before he ever swung up onto his horse and rode off into the dark toward a war nobody in that basement could have fully predicted the shape of yet. Two very different men on two very different sides of that same struggle gave the place two wildly different names. The statesman Daniel Webster later called it simply the headquarters of the Revolution. The colony's own royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, watching from the opposite side, called that same building a nest of sedition. Both of them, in their own way, were describing the exact same low-ceilinged basement room, the exact kind of space we've spent this entire video treating as nothing more than a place to eat supper and complain about your bedfellow. And the Green Dragon's political life didn't end with the war itself either. Years later, in the winter of 1788, a gathering of Boston's tradesmen and mechanics met at that same tavern to pass resolutions, urging support for the newly proposed federal constitution, the very document that, as we discussed earlier tonight, had been drafted partly in response to an armed uprising that once used another New England tavern as its own headquarters. Two taverns hundreds of miles apart, quietly bookending the exact same constitutional story from opposite ends, neither one aware of the role the other was playing in it. Sit with that contradiction for a moment, because I think it's the real heart of everything we've walked through together tonight. A tavern was never simply a mattress and a meal. We've said this before in a smaller way when we talked about how one building could double as a courthouse, a bank and a town square all at once. The Green Dragon takes that same idea and pushes it all the way to its logical historic extreme. Under the right roof with the right people, quietly talking over the right mugs of ale, an ordinary tavern table turned out to be exactly where a new country got its start. And it wasn't the only one. Down in Philadelphia, a rather grander establishment called the City Tavern hosted members of the First and Second Continental Congress, between sessions delegates arguing, negotiating, and occasionally simply blowing off steam, in between the formal debates happening a short walk away. George Washington himself dined there. So did most of the men whose signatures now sit at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence, gathered around tables not so different from the ones Sarah once sat at, wondering what to make of a badly cooked fricassee. The building itself never made a single law. It just happened to be where the people writing those laws went to eat, drink, and keep talking once the official meeting adjourned for the evening. History, it turns out, rarely confines itself neatly to the rooms specifically built for it. Here's a question worth sitting with, given everything we now know about how these buildings actually worked. If a tavern's back room could quietly host the planning of a revolution, is it really so surprising that the very same building earlier that same evening might have had a farmer, a stranger, and a slightly drunk travelling doctor, all sharing one sagging rope bed upstairs? These were never two separate categories of place. It was always the exact same room doing extraordinary and completely ordinary work in the very same breath, sometimes within the very same hour. The fate of a nation and the fate of someone's ruined supper unfolding under one shared roof. A tavern never really had the luxury of choosing which kind of history it wanted to be part of on any given night. It simply opened its doors and let whoever walked through them decide. Now, everything we've spent tonight exploring the shared beds, the questionable suppers, the bedbugs, the danger on the road, all of it belonged to a particular era that eventually quietly came to an end. And the moment it ended is worth knowing, because it wraps this whole story up rather neatly. On October the 16th, 1829, a new kind of building opened its doors on the corner of Tremont and Beacon Streets in Boston. Of all places, not far at all from where the Green Dragon once stood, two very different chapters of the same city's history, sitting almost within walking distance of each other. It was called the Tremont House, and historians generally consider it the very first modern hotel in the United States. Everything about it was built to solve the exact problems we've spent this entire video experiencing together, as though someone had simply sat down with a list of every complaint we've covered tonight and designed a building specifically to answer each one. Guests were shown to private single or double rooms, each one fitted with an actual working lock on the door, a truly revolutionary improvement over what the same historians describe plainly as the prevailing custom of travellers sharing a room and often a bed with one or more complete strangers. There was free soap waiting in every room, a small luxury that would have seemed almost absurd to a traveller used to washing, with whatever water happened to be sitting nearby. There was indoor plumbing, water closets and heated bathing rooms, unheard of luxuries at the time, replacing the chamber pot and the shared basin with something considerably more private. There were bellboys to carry your luggage, and an actual reception desk where your arrival was expected and recorded in advance, rather than simply hoped for on a first-come, first-served basis. Even the building's granite construction and brick arches were specifically designed to resist exactly the kind of fire that had quietly destroyed so many wooden taverns before it. The lesson of 100 burned buildings finally built directly into the architecture itself. A door that locked, a bed that was actually entirely your own. It's almost strange to say it plainly after everything we've covered tonight, but that combination was for most travellers in this story a genuine novelty, arriving only after roughly 2 centuries of sharing, shifting and quietly negotiating space with whoever else happened to be passing through that same night. So here's where I want to leave you tonight if you've made it all this way with me. We started this evening with a woman named Sarah alone on a horse at 3 in the afternoon, riding into a darkness she couldn't fully see the edges of toward a tavern, where she'd end up sharing a bed with a stranger and lying awake past midnight listening to grown men argue about a word. We learned what that tavern actually was, legally, socially, almost accidentally becoming the courthouse, the bank and the town square of an entire community rolled into one low-ceilinged room. We watched travellers scramble for a place on a first-come, first-served floor, and we watched 2 future presidents argue over an open window in a bed neither one of them chose, one of them lecturing the other on the science of cold air until his audience simply fell asleep mid-sentence. We pulled apart the very mattress underneath all of that drama straw and corn husks and a rope frame that quietly rolled every sleeper toward the centre, whether they meant to end up there or not, and we sat with the small, itchy truth that no amount of money ever fully protected anyone from what was hiding in the seams. We met a woman named Eliza who built her own privacy out of nothing but 2 coats and quiet determination riding toward a reunion that had already unknown to her become impossible. We learned about a courtship custom stranger than fiction, a wooden board and a captured enemy officer, and a room full of country women who refused to let a visiting minister shame them for how they raised their daughters. We met another widow Anna whose tavern hosted an armed rebellion, and whose name still appears in the earliest records of the United States Supreme Court, a woman whose life began in scandal and ended in genuine legal history. We sat down at last to actually eat and drink, tracing one small word, groaning all the way from a mother's childbirth table to a feast so heavy the boards themselves seemed to complain under the weight of it. And we stepped back outside into real danger, a highwayman's short violent career, and a fire that could take an entire building and everyone sleeping inside it without ever announcing itself first. None of these people knew they were part of something historians would eventually spend centuries picking apart. They were simply trying to get from one place to another, tired, often cold, usually hungry, and almost never quite as alone as they might have preferred. If there's one thought worth carrying with you as you drift off tonight, let it be this: privacy. Comfort a door that locks a bed nobody else has any claim to. These are not ancient permanent features of being human. They are remarkably new inventions built slowly, imperfectly over centuries by ordinary people simply trying to get a decent night's rest under whatever roof happened to be available to them. We gained something real when we finally got that locked door, that private room, that bed belonging to nobody but ourselves. But it's worth wondering honestly what quietly slipped away in the trade. Sarah's forced conversation with the stranger, Eliza's ingenuity sewn together out of 2 borrowed coats, Anna's tap room loud enough to hold an entire rebellion inside it, a crowded, imperfect, occasionally miserable kind of closeness that none of us would probably choose today, and that most of us, if we're honest, will also never fully experience again. There's a strange kind of loneliness built into all this modern comfort, isn't there, if you sit with it long enough? We finally got the privacy every single person in tonight's story would have desperately wanted, and in getting it, we quietly lost the version of the world where a stranger's warmth on the coldest night of the year was simply something you learned to expect, rather than something you'd cross the street to avoid. The next time you climb into your own bed alone in your own quiet room, it might be worth a small, quiet moment of gratitude for just how recent and how truly hard one that particular comfort actually is. And maybe a small moment of curiosity too about everyone who once had to share the exact same journey with a stranger they never chose, and somehow most nights made it through until morning anyway. Thank you for spending this night with me and with Sarah, and with all the strangers, travellers and tavern keepers who somehow ended up sharing it with us along the way. Putting a night like this together takes real digging old diaries, old court records, old dictionaries. Nobody opens anymore, and it means more than you probably know that you stayed for the whole journey, rather than just the first few minutes. If any part of tonight's story kept you good company, I would love to hear which part actually stayed with you. Maybe it was Sarah's sharp reply to a nosy stranger on the road. Maybe it was Franklin's stubborn little lecture on fresh air, or Anna Bingham standing before the Supreme Court after everything her early life had already put her through. Maybe it was simply the thought of that groaning board piled high, waiting for you at the end of a long, hard day of travel. Whatever it was, tell me in the comments below. I go through every single one, and I mean that. And if you're new here, consider staying a while longer. There's a whole world of nights like this one waiting quiet corners of history most people never think to ask about, and I truly love the company. Rest well tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from. Pull the blanket up a little higher, let your thoughts drift somewhere between a rope bed and a locked hotel door, and know that whatever kept you company on this particular evening, you made it all the way to the end with us. There's another story and another night waiting for us very soon. I'll be right here when you're ready for it.